Hello everyone, I'm your storyteller, and I'm here to guide you tonight. I know you're watching this to unwind and drift off to sleep. So before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. By the way, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it there? Let's allow the darkness to take over and set the mood. Now, flip your phone upside down, leave all your worries behind, and make yourself comfortable. Relax, and let's get started. It was the month of October, a Thursday evening. The sun had already begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the quiet woods. I remember the air that night hit was thick with humidity, almost suffocating, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The day had been warm, sticky with the heat of early autumn, and I was out in the forest with my family, as we often were, a shuffle of feet. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, straining to listen. Maybe it was them, maybe it was just the wind, but I had to find out. I called their names again, but the storm roared back, louder than before, as if mocking my desperation. The rain, if possible, seemed to intensify. I felt it seeping through my jacket, down my spine, soaking into my skin. My shoes were heavy with mud, my feet slipping with every step. The trees, usually swaying gently in the breeze, seemed to stand still, like statues watching. It was as if they were waiting for something. We had ventured off the beaten track, following a narrow trail that had quickly disappeared into the thickening underbrush. I didn't think much of it at the time. We always wandered off course during our hikes, sometimes veering into areas that were a little more rugged. But as we pushed forward, I noticed something strange. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the occasional bird call, had gone silent. The air had grown unnaturally still, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I looked up, scanning the sky, and that's when I noticed it. The clouds had changed, no longer the soft, fluffy kind you expect from a peaceful autumn afternoon. These clouds were dark, swirling ominously, as if the heavens themselves were preparing for something terrible. The wind had started to rise gently at first, whispering through the trees, before it began to pick up speed, pulling at my clothes and tangling my hair. I shivered, despite the warmth. The first rumble of thunder reached my ears, distant but unmistakable. It echoed through the trees, a deep, low sound that seemed to vibrate through my chest. It was the kind of thunder you feel before you hear, the kind that tells you something is coming. My heart began to beat faster. I turned to look for my family, but something was wrong. I couldn't find them. I had been walking ahead, lost in my own thoughts, and they must have stopped to take in the view, but there was no sign of them now. I called out, my voice sounding small against the rising wind. Mom, Dad, nothing. The storm, now closer, seemed to swallow my voice whole. I took a few steps back, calling out again, louder this time, but the forest had turned into an eerie quiet. The wind whipped through the trees, but there were no sounds of footsteps, no answering calls, no rustling leaves. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the fear creep in. I walked back along the path I had come from, but it was already fading, swallowed by the thickening mist. The storm was growing stronger. The first drops of rain began to fall, large and cold against my skin, but the rain was not the only thing falling. A sense of dread began to settle in my chest, creeping through my ribs like ice. I tried to shake it off. It was just a storm, after all. I wasn't alone. I couldn't be alone. My family had to be somewhere, just ahead or behind me. I convinced myself of that as I moved deeper into the woods, the storm picking up its intensity with each passing moment. The thunder grew louder, shaking the ground beneath me. The wind howled, tearing through the trees, sending branches crashing to the ground. And yet, all I could hear was my own breath, quick and shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. The raindrops now hit the earth with such force it sounded like hail, splattering around me, blurring my vision. The once familiar path had become a muddy, slippery mess, and every step felt like it was pulling me deeper into the unknown. I looked around frantically, desperate to catch a glimpse of anyone, but all I could see was a gray blur of rain and mist. The trees had become dark shadows in the storm, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching out to grab me. My legs were shaking, and I couldn't tell if it was the cold or the fear. I had been calling for them, Mom, Dad, but now my voice felt weak, drowned out by the roar of the storm. I stopped for a moment, listening. The thunder seemed to subside, just for an instant, and in that silence, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling, a shuffle of feet. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, straining to listen. Maybe it was them, maybe it was just the wind, but I had to find out. I called their names again, but the storm roared back, louder than before, as if mocking my desperation. The rain, if possible, seemed to intensify. I felt it seeping through my jacket, down my spine, soaking into my skin. My shoes were heavy with mud, my feet slipping with every step. It felt like the forest itself was closing in on me, the trees growing thicker, the shadows deeper. I stumbled forward, heart racing, the sound of thunder now deafening, like the whole sky was about to split apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything fell silent. The wind stopped. The rain stopped. The thunder faded into the distance, leaving behind an unsettling stillness, a silence that felt like it was pressing against my ears. My thoughts began to race. Was I hallucinating? Was I hearing things? I couldn't tell anymore. The only sound now was the rapid beating of my heart. I stood there, waiting, unsure of what to do next, and that's when I heard it. A soft voice, barely audible over the quiet. Is someone there? It was a voice I knew, a voice I had been searching for. My heart jumped in my chest. Mom, I called, stepping toward the sound. The voice echoed again, this time clearer, closer. I moved faster, not caring any more about the mud or the rain that continued to soak through my clothes. Mom, I shouted, my voice cracking in the still air. The voice, so faint at first, grew louder. It was her. It had to be. But as I pushed forward, the storm that had once seemed distant was back, louder and more violent than ever. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, carrying with it the sound of my name, whispered on the wind. The voice was gone. The silence that followed felt like 1,000 years. The storm continued to rage, but now, for the first time that night, I was truly aware of my surroundings. The trees, the wet ground, the distant flashes of lightning all seemed to close in on me. Was I still searching for them? Or had I become lost in the storm myself? That night, I didn't find my family. Not then, not in the way I hoped. And as I walked, soaked to the bone, deeper into the storm, I understood something. The forest was not just an empty place. It had swallowed me whole, wrapping me in its darkness, in its silence, and I was not sure I would ever find my way back. It was a little after 9:30 p.m., the clock on my phone flickering dimly in my trembling hand. The storm had worsened since I last checked. What had started as a gentle rain was now a fierce downpour, pelting the ground with such force that it seemed to erase all trace of the path I had just walked. I hadn't thought to check the time before, but it didn't matter anymore. Time had stopped making sense the moment I lost sight of my family, the moment I realized that the storm was no longer just a weather event. It was a force with purpose, a creature of its own. I stood still for a moment, holding my breath, listening to the world around me. The sound of the rain was deafening, its rhythm almost hypnotic, yet I felt an uneasy tension in the air. The wind howled as it whipped through the trees, bending the branches so violently that I thought they might snap under the pressure. In the sudden silence between the gusts, the forest seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing, watching, waiting. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but something was wrong. The path I had come down was gone. It had vanished completely, swallowed by a dense, swirling fog that had crept in without warning. My heart skipped a beat. I had only taken my eyes off the trail for a moment, just long enough to call out for my family. But now the path had disappeared, as if it had never existed. The trees, once so familiar, now seemed alien. Their trunks were mere silhouettes against the gray mist, and their branches twisted like the fingers of long-forgotten creatures reaching out to claim me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, a sensation that was far worse than the cold, biting rain against my skin. The air itself seemed to be pressing in on me, thick with an unnatural weight. I tried to breathe, but it felt like I was inhaling the very fog that surrounded me. I swallowed, trying to steady my thoughts, but they scattered, leaving me with nothing but panic and confusion. "Mom?" My voice broke through the air, barely audible above the storm. The sound of my own words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, but there was no answer. Not even an echo. I waited, listening. The forest was silent, save for the harsh wind and the relentless pattering of rain. Every shadow around me seemed to flicker and dance, like dark phantoms moving just beyond the reach of the trees. The storm had worsened since I last checked. What had started as a gentle rain was now a fierce downpour, pelting the ground with such force that it seemed to erase all trace of the path I had just walked. I hadn't thought to check the time before, but it didn't matter anymore. Time had stopped making sense the moment I lost sight of my family. The moment I realized that the storm was no longer just a weather event. It was a force with purpose. The thought hit me with full force. What if the storm is taking them? What if the storm is not just a storm at all? I shook my head, pushing the thought away, but it stuck with me, growing darker with each passing second. I was trapped, lost in a forest that had swallowed not only my family, but my sense of reality too. The path was gone. My family was gone. And all I had left was the storm, and this eerie, suffocating fog that pressed in closer with each passing moment. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move. There was no point in standing still. Maybe I could find them again. Maybe if I just kept walking, I would stumble across them somewhere, somehow. But each step seemed to take me further into the unknown. I stumbled over roots, the slick mud beneath my feet pulling at my shoes, the rain blurring my vision. My fingers were numb, and my mind felt fogged with confusion. But I kept going, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the fog would lift, the path would return, and I would hear my family's voices again. As I walked, I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement just beyond the mist, a shadow. My heart surged with hope. Could it be them? I took off in that direction, my footsteps hasty and desperate, crashing through the underbrush. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the oppressive fog in its wake. "Mom, Dad," my voice trembled, my throat sore from calling out so many times already. The wind carried my voice away, and I strained my ears, waiting for any sign that anyone was out there. But all I heard was the storm, the wild howling of the wind, the sharp crackle of thunder, and the relentless rain. I began to feel like I was walking in circles, like the forest itself was shifting around me. It was as if the very ground beneath my feet was altering, changing, taking me somewhere I couldn't follow. The trees that had been to my left moments before were now to my right, and the direction I thought I had been heading seemed impossible to define. It was then that the real terror settled in, the sense that this forest, this storm, was not just a physical challenge. It was something much darker. The wind whispered through the trees, its voice now unmistakably clear. It wasn't just the sound of the storm, it was something else, something that felt like it was trying to speak to me. I couldn't understand the words, but the rhythm, the tone, sent chills running through my entire body. Suddenly, I was aware of something else, something I had been too frightened to notice before. The shadows, they were moving, but not in the way they should. They were not cast by the trees or the flicker of lightning. No, these shadows seemed to have a life of their own, creeping, shifting, growing, and shrinking with each gust of wind. They lurked just outside my line of sight, always there, always watching. I wanted to run, to escape, but where? There was no path anymore, no road to safety, only the deepening fog, the shadows that threatened to consume me, and the ever-growing roar of the storm. And somewhere in the distance, in the very heart of the storm, I thought I heard something else, something that made my heart stop in my chest. It was my name, Isabel. ... The voice was faint, barely a whisper, but it was clear. It was a voice I knew. It was my mother's voice. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. I had heard it. I knew I had heard it. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the storm before I could say another word. The fog thickened around me, obscuring everything. The trees. Was I hearing things? Was I losing my mind? Or had the storm truly stolen them away? The shadows pressed in closer, swirling around me like a living thing, blocking my escape. I couldn't tell which way to go, couldn't even tell where I was anymore. Every direction looked the same. I took a step forward, but the ground felt uneven, as though the earth itself was shifting beneath me. The mist wrapped around my body, pulling at my feet like invisible hands, urging me to stop, to give in. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop. Not until I found them. The storm raged on, the shadows continuing their dance at the edges of my vision, and I was left to wonder how long would it take before I became one of them. A shadow lost to the fog, forgotten by the world. Would my name be lost to the storm too? The storm had taken on a life of its own, a living, breathing entity that seemed determined to swallow everything in its path. I could hardly see my hand in front of my face, the mist and rain blurring every feature of the world around me. My heart was racing, my mind dizzy from the disorienting sense of being utterly lost. I stumbled forward through the wet underbrush, hoping that something, anything, would break the suffocating silence that had fallen over me. The world felt muffled, like I was submerged underwater, the sound of the rain and wind mixing into an incomprehensible roar. Every step was harder than the last, the ground soft and treacherous beneath my feet. And yet, despite everything, there was something more terrifying than the storm. A feeling that I wasn't alone. I don't know why it took me so long to realize, but there was something out there. Someone, a voice faint, like the whisper of a dream, called my name. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The storm had a way of making everything seem alive, twisting the world into something unfamiliar. But then the voice came again, clearer this time, with an unmistakable urgency. Isabel. It was my name. I recognized it immediately, but the question was, who was calling me? It wasn't my mom or dad. The voice wasn't their gentle tone. It was something else, something soft and ethereal, like the wind itself was trying to speak. I froze in place, my pulse pounding in my ears. The voice wasn't far off. It had come from the direction of the trees, somewhere in the fog. But it was impossible to tell if it was real, or if the storm was playing tricks on me. No, I thought to myself, it's real. It has to be real. I took a tentative step forward, my shoes squelching in the wet mud. The rain was coming down harder now, the droplets like cold needles against my skin. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it offered little protection. The voice came again, just a whisper this time, as if the storm was drowning it out. Isabel. I strained my ears, but the voice was fading, pulled away by the gusts of wind that howled through the trees. Was it truly someone out there, or had the storm twisted my perception, making me hear things? I couldn't be sure, but there was something in the way the voice had called me, something in the way it seemed to reach for me, that made my feet move on their own. The ground was slippery, my legs aching with every step, but I moved toward the voice, my heart thrumming with a mixture of hope and fear. Maybe it was my family. Maybe they were lost too, and this was their way of finding me. The thought pushed me forward, despite the fear tightening in my chest. I needed to find them. I needed to hear their voices again. The trees around me seemed to shift, their branches reaching out like long, gnarled fingers, their shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. The fog wrapped around them, blending them into a single, indistinct mass. Every sound felt magnified, the creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, the cold slap of raindrops against my skin. But despite the cacophony, the voice still lingered in my mind. "Isabel," I called out in return, my voice barely audible over the storm. "Mom, Dad." The words seemed to vanish in the air, swallowed by the wind. The trees around me whispered, but it wasn't a friendly sound. It felt like the forest was responding, mocking me. The voice had come from somewhere close, but as I moved, the distance between us seemed to grow. Was I walking in circles? I stopped for a moment, trying to steady my thoughts. The fog, the rain, the storm, they all blurred together, making it hard to tell where I had been or where I was going. I looked around, but there was nothing but the same endless forest, the same twisted trees and thick mist. The voice came again, but now it was louder, clearer. "Isabel, where are you?" A chill crept down my spine. This time the voice wasn't distant. It was right here, just ahead. My heart skipped in my chest. I was closer now. I could hear it so clearly, as if the voice was standing beside me. Yet there was no one, just the mist and the storm. I stepped forward, my breath catching in my throat. Every inch felt like I was walking through a nightmare, the tension building with each step. But I couldn't stop. The voice was calling me, and I needed to answer. The rain began to fall harder, the sound of it deafening now. I felt as though I was drowning, the rain rushing into my ears, flooding my thoughts. The voice came again, this time urgent. "Isabel, please." I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This time, the voice had carried something else with it, something that wasn't just fear, but a deep, aching sadness. A cry for help. But from where? From who? I turned around, my eyes wide, searching the fog. There was nothing. The path behind me was just as invisible as the one ahead. The rain blurred the world, turning it into a gray smear of nothingness. Was this part of the storm's trickery? Was it really someone calling me? Or was the wind manipulating my mind, creating a phantom voice to lead me astray? "Isabel, don't go." This voice, however, was different. It was softer, almost tender, as if it were trying to protect me. My name had been spoken with such gentle concern that it brought a shiver to my bones. For a split second, I thought I recognized it in my mother's voice. But it couldn't be, could it? I staggered backward, confusion flooding my mind. The air around me was thick with mist, and the storm continued to rage. But now everything felt ... wrong. I had been moving forward, drawn by the voice, but now I hesitated. The voice I had been chasing had changed. Had it always been my mother? Or had I simply hoped it was? The wind howled again, and in that moment, I realized that no one was out there. No one could hear me, and the only thing that was truly speaking to me ... was the storm itself. It was a strange, frightening realization, one that seemed to strip away all my hope. There were no answers in the forest, only whispers, and shadows that twisted around me like ghosts, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. The voice was gone now, swallowed up by the storm. What had started as a call for help had turned into nothing more than an echo in the wind. And just like that, I was alone, again lost in the endless fog, with nothing left but the sound of the rain and the whispers of the storm. The storm was relentless, as if the heavens themselves were trying to tear the world apart. The wind howled through the trees, a low, mournful sound that echoed in the fog. The rain, once a simple downpour, had become a torrential wave, each drop stinging like a needle as it struck my skin. I could barely see anything beyond a few feet in front of me, the mist and the shadows blurring everything into an indistinct smear of gray. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. My body ached from the cold, the exhaustion of running through the forest, and the fear that had been slowly sinking in. This wasn't just a storm anymore. This was something far worse. I could feel it in my bones, a sense of growing dread that made my heart pound faster with every passing second. It was October 23rd, late in the evening, when the world had gone dark in more ways than one. My phone had died hours ago, leaving me without any contact to the outside world, nothing to hold on to except my own frantic thoughts. My family, where were they? The last time I saw them, we were together, huddled beneath the trees, trying to take shelter from the storm. But in this dense, wild forest, I had lost them. As I stumbled through the underbrush, the wet bark of trees brushing against my trembling fingers, I tried to steady myself. The ground beneath my feet was slick with mud, my shoes sinking deeper with each step. I reached out, feeling the roughness of a tree trunk, hoping for something solid to hold on to. But all I found were more trees, more wet, slippery surfaces, and shadows stretching unnaturally in the mist. The fog was thick now, crawling along the ground, making it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. The wind whipped around me, sending shivers through my soaked clothes, and the eerie silence between gusts made the forest feel alive. Watching, waiting. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. The sound seemed to disappear into the air, swallowed by the dark. "Dad," nothing. No response. Just the sound of my own voice echoing back at me, warped and distant. I felt an icy hand of fear grip my chest. They were gone, weren't they? Or was I the one who was lost? I stumbled again, my legs growing weaker with every step. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the panic creeping up again, taking hold of my thoughts. It was as if the forest itself was closing in around me. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches reaching out like hands, twisting in the wind. The shadows between them seemed to stretch and shift, like they were alive. Every time I glanced toward them, it felt like something was watching me, just beyond the fog. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it, or if it was real. But it couldn't be, could it? I staggered backward, confusion flooding my mind. The air around me was thick with mist, and the storm continued to rage, but now everything felt ... wrong. I had been moving forward, drawn by the voice, but now I hesitated. The voice I had been chasing had changed. Had it always been my mother, or had I simply hoped it was? The wind howled again, and in that moment, I realized that no one was out there. No one could hear me, and the only thing that was truly speaking to me, ... was the storm itself. My family, where were they? The last time I saw them, we were together, huddled beneath the trees, trying to take shelter from the storm. But in this dense wild forest, I had lost them. As I stumbled through the underbrush, the wet bark of trees brushing against my trembling fingers, I tried to steady myself. My eyes burned from the stinging droplets, my vision blurred, and I wiped at my face with the sleeve of my jacket, trying to clear my eyes. But it didn't help. The fog was too thick, the darkness too deep. I couldn't see past the shadows. I took another step forward, reaching out for something, anything, to guide me. My fingers brushed against something smooth, and for a moment, I thought I'd found a branch or another tree. But when I looked closer, I realized it was a stona, large flat stone covered in moss. I knelt down, trying to steady my breath, feeling the cold seeping into my skin. The rain fell harder, the storm relentless, but I couldn't stop. I had to find my family. I had to keep moving, keep searching. I stood up again, and in that moment, I thought I saw something. Through the mist, through the shadows, there was a flicker of movement, a shape. It was faint, barely visible, but it looked like a person, a figure, moving through the fog. I gasped, my heart leaping with hope. Could it be? I stepped forward, my legs trembling, my fingers clutched around the stone for support. The shape moved again, just ahead, slipping between the trees. I took a step toward it, then another, desperate to close the distance. My mind was racing. Was this really my family? Was I finally going to find them? But as I moved closer, the figure disappeared into the mist, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I stopped dead in my tracks, my chest tightening in disbelief. The fog swallowed it whole, leaving only the sound of the rain and the wind. No, I was seeing things. There was no one out there. I was alone. The realization hit me hard. The storm was playing tricks on me, weaving its web of confusion and fear. My mind was a haze, clouded by the noise, the darkness, and the terrifying loneliness of this endless forest. Every shadow, every gust of wind, seemed to twist and pull at me, making me question what was real and what wasn't. I was lost, truly lost. I sank to my knees in the mud, the cold seeping into my bones. The storm raged on around me, the wind whipping through the trees, and the rain fell in relentless sheets, but it didn't matter anymore. There was no hope of finding my family, no hope of finding my way out. I was alone in the darkness, and the storm had stolen everything from me. And as the fog crept in, swallowing me whole, I realized the true horror. The forest had become my prison, and there was no way out. The rain continued to pour in relentless sheets, each drop a cold reminder of how alone I was. The world around me felt like it was closing in, the thick fog wrapping itself around the trees and turning them into shadowy figures that loomed over me, watching in silence. Every step I took through the muddy forest floor was like wading through a nightmare. My feet sinking deeper into the earth with each attempt to move forward. The storm had become something more than just a weather event, had become a force, an unyielding presence that held me captive in its thrall. I was beginning to lose all sense of time. It felt like hours since I had last seen my family, and in the midst of this storm, the world had turned into a confusing blur of rain, mist, and shadows. My body was exhausted, shivering uncontrollably from both the cold and the weight of fear pressing down on me. Every time I called out for my parents, the only response I received was the howling wind, as if the forest itself had swallowed their voices. And then, as if the storm had conspired to offer me a sliver of hope, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. My eyes, still blurry from the rain and my own exhaustion, focused on the ground before me. There, half submerged in the mud, were footprints, small, shallow indentations in the wet earth. I felt a jolt of hope shoot through me. Could it be? Could this be a sign that I wasn't alone after all? That maybe, just maybe, I had found someone who could lead me back to my family. I crouched down, my fingers brushing the wet mud as I examined the footprints. They were too fresh to have been left long ago. My heart began to race as I looked closer. They didn't look like my own. They weren't my parents either. They were smaller, lighter impressions in the earth, shaped in a way that suggested someone who had been walking barefoot or in very light shoes. The storm raged on around me, the wind whipping through the trees, and the rain fell in relentless sheets. But it didn't matter anymore. There was no hope of finding my family, no hope of finding my way out. I was alone in the darkness, and the storm had stolen everything from me. And as the fog crept in, swallowing me whole, I realized the true horror. The forest had become my prison, and there was no way out. The rain continued to pour in relentless sheets, each drop a cold reminder of how alone I was. The path ahead was barely visible through the mist, but the footprints were clear enough to follow. I stumbled over branches and roots, my eyes scanning the ground as I tried to keep pace. The sound of my breathing mixed with the deafening roar of the rain, but I could feel something else, something deeper pressing against me. The forest seemed to close in, and my every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know, and then it did. The thunder crashed suddenly, so loudly and violently that I flinched, my body jerking with the shock. The sound felt like it came from deep within the earth, reverberating through the trees and the ground beneath my feet. My heart leaped in my chest, and for a split second, I couldn't breathe. The noise was deafening, like the sky itself had cracked open, releasing all of its fury at once. I staggered backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. The impact of the thunder had shaken me to my core, and my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. The path ahead was barely visible through the mist, but the footprints were clear enough to follow. I stumbled over branches and roots, my eyes scanning the ground as I tried to keep pace. The sound of my breathing mixed with the deafening roar of the rain, but I could feel something else, something deeper pressing against me. The forest seemed to close in, and my every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know. My heart skipped a beat as I moved toward it. It wasn't a person, but it was something that hadn't been there before. It was a stick, or perhaps a broken branch, lying across the path, and beside it, there was a fresh impression in the mud, another footprint. But this one was different. It was larger than the others, deeper, like it had been made by someone with more weight, someone who had been walking ahead of the smaller footprints. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. There was someone else out here. Someone who had left these prints, someone I hadn't seen yet. I stood frozen, the realization creeping over me like a cold sweat. The footprints weren't just a sign of another lost soul, but of someone who had been here longer. Someone who knew this forest better than I did. Someone who was ahead of me, guiding me somewhere, or leading me astray. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced around, but the fog was thick, and the trees closed in like a maze. My mind raced. Could this person be part of my family? Someone who had been lost, just like me? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone who had been following me, watching me from the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led deeper into the forest, deeper into the storm. The footprints were fading, slipping away with each passing moment. The rain fell harder, the wind picking up again, and the forest seemed to come alive with strange, distorted sounds. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind, made me flinch. I took another step forward, my legs heavy with fear, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. But the footprints had already begun to blur again, the trail fading into the darkness. I was losing them, losing myself. My hands, covered in mud and rain, clenched at my sides. The storm was closing in, and I was left alone in the depths of the forest, uncertain whether the footprints had ever really been there at all. I stood still, listening to the storm rage around me, trying to decide which way to go. But all I could hear was the wind and the haunting silence that followed. The trail was gone, and so was my hope. The storm had only grown stronger as the night dragged on. The rain, relentless and cold, pounded against the trees and soaked through every inch of my clothes. My body shivered with a mix of exhaustion and fear, but I couldn't stop moving. I couldn't stop searching for any sign of my family. Every gust of wind felt like it could push me over, and the fog clung to the trees, making the forest look like a nightmare I couldn't escape. I had no idea how long I had been wandering in the storm. Time had become a blur, and with each passing moment, it felt as though the world around me was slowly slipping into chaos. The sounds of the forest were muffled by the constant roar of the wind and the heavy downpour. But deep inside my chest, I could feel the storm's intensity, rising like the very air itself was charging with tension, ready to explode. And then it did. The thunder crashed suddenly, so loudly and violently that I flinched, my body jerking with the shock. The sound felt like it came from deep within the earth, reverberating through the trees and the ground beneath my feet. My heart leaped in my chest, and for a split second, I couldn't breathe. The noise was deafening, like the sky itself had cracked open, releasing all of its fury at once. I staggered backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. The impact of the thunder had shaken me to my core, and my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time the wind howled, every time a tree creaked in the distance, I felt it, the undeniable sense that something was following me, lurking just out of sight. My thoughts spun as I stumbled through the mud-soaked ground. My feet were numb, my clothes drenched, and my heart was racing. Where were they? Where was my family? One step. I had to keep looking, keep searching. The wind howled, whipping through the trees and sending branches crashing to the ground. The rain came down in sheets, stinging my face, but I pressed on, my eyes scanning the fog for any sign of movement. The rain still pounded the ground in a rhythm, but the silence between the thunderclaps was suffocating. Mom, Dad. My voice cracked as I called out, but the words felt so small, so insignificant against the backdrop of the storm's roar. No response. I couldn't stop. I couldn't give up. I took another step, but then a movement in the distance caught my eye. I froze, my pulse quickening. Was it them? Could it be my parents? I squinted, straining to see through the fog. The fear that had been a small whisper in the back of my mind began to grow louder, and the thought that I might truly be alone in this vast, storm-ravaged forest hit me harder than any crack of thunder. A low, distant rumble of thunder echoed once more, but this time it felt different. It was almost as if it was drawing closer. A shiver ran through me, and I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the dread that was beginning to crawl up my spine. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. The rain still pounded the ground in a rhythm, but the silence between the thunderclaps was suffocating. Mom, Dad. My voice cracked as I called out, but the words felt so small, so insignificant against the backdrop of the storm's roar. No response. I couldn't stop. I couldn't give up. I took another step, but then a movement in the distance caught my eye. I froze, my pulse quickening. Was it them? Could it be my parents? I squinted, straining to see through the fog. It was hard to make out through the heavy mist and rain, but there just ahead, a faint silhouette. Moving through the trees, my heart leaped in my chest. I couldn't tell if it was the storm playing tricks on me, but it looked like someone was there. I could see the figure moving, but with each step I took toward it, it seemed to slip further into the shadows. I ran toward it, my feet slipping in the mud, my breath ragged as I pushed forward, praying it was them. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The fog swallowed it whole, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of dread behind. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking with desperation. The wind answered, howling louder than ever, but there was no other sound, no reply. My hope deflated like a balloon, the weight of it pressing down on me. I was still alone. And this storm, this unrelenting storm, wasn't going to stop until it had torn me apart. The thunder cracked again, louder this time, as if it had been waiting for my heart to break. The sky seemed to open up, pouring down on me with such intensity that I was momentarily blinded by the sheer force of it. I tried to shield my face with my arms, but the rain lashed at me like sharp needles. As I stood there, soaked and shivering, I realized the truth. The storm wasn't just about the rain or the wind. It was about something else, a feeling of helplessness, of being lost, of being swallowed by the world around me. I had no way of knowing where I was, no way of finding my way out. The storm had taken everything from me, my family, my safety, my sense of self, and now it was taking my hope. And in that moment, under the roar of the thunder and the crushing weight of the storm, I understood. I wasn't just lost in the forest, I was lost in the storm, and there was no one left to find me. The night was drawing deeper into its dark embrace. The rain hadn't slowed, and the storm still howled above me, its fury seeming endless. The air was thick with the wind of the wind and water, and my body felt like it was being pulled into the very heart of the forest, deeper and deeper into the unknown. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time the wind howled, every time a tree creaked in the distance, I felt the undeniable sense that something was following me, lurking just out of sight. My thoughts spun as I stumbled through the mud-soaked ground. My feet were numb, my clothes drenched, and my heart was racing. Where were they? Where was my family? I felt like I had been walking for hours, though I wasn't sure how much time had passed since I had lost sight of them. All I knew was that I had to keep going. Suddenly, something caught my broken branch, lying across the path in front of me. It was freshly snapped, its jagged edges still glistening with moisture from the storm. I crouched down, examining the broken remnants, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It was as if something or someone had passed through here in a hurry. The branch wasn't just fallen, it had been forcefully broken, twisted in a way that suggested urgency, panic. My pulse quickened, and my fingers trembled as they brushed against the sharp edges of the splintered wood. My mind raced, and a chill crept up my spine. Was it my family? Had they been here too? Or was something else moving through the forest? My heart pounded, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone, that there were eyes watching me from the shadows of the trees. It felt like the storm itself had turned against me, its winds whispering something I couldn't understand. I stood, my legs unsteady, and scanned the surrounding darkness. The trees seemed to bend in the wind, their branches groaning as if in agony. The fog thickened, and the world around me seemed to blur, twisting into shadows that I couldn't make sense of. Everything felt wrong, and the air hung heavy with tension, like a warning I couldn't ignore. The forest felt alive, but not in a way that made me feel safe. No, this was different. It felt like the forest was alive in a dark, hungry way, as though it was waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for me to slip up so it could swallow me whole. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. I wanted to call out. I wanted to scream for my family, for anyone to answer me, but I knew in my gut that I was only calling into the void. My voice would be drowned by the storm, swallowed by the trees. I stepped back from the broken branch, my mind whirling with questions. Who had passed through here? What had happened to my family? The rain fell harder, the downpour blurring everything around me, and I couldn't shake the sense of something moving just out of reach. The whispers of the wind seemed to grow louder, almost like they were trying to say something to me, something important, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I felt a shift in the air, like something was wrong. My senses heightened, and I turned, scanning the shadows between the trees, looking for any sign of movement. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me. The thunder rumbled in the distance, but this time it wasn't a crash of nature's power. It was a warning, a rumble that seemed to reverberate through my bones, telling me to leave, to run, to find shelter before it was too late. But where could I go? I took a few hesitant steps forward, my eyes still glued to the shadows, my ears straining to catch any sound that might help me make sense of what was happening. A flicker of movement caught my shadow darting between the trees. I froze, my breath hitching in my chest. Was it real? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me, my fear turning the wind and rain into something darker, something alive? I couldn't tell. I wanted to call out. I was afraid that if I spoke, I would draw something closer, something I didn't want to see. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and my mind screamed at me to run, to get away, to find safety. But how could I run when I didn't know where I was or where I could go? The broken branch was still on the ground, a silent reminder that something had been here before me, that hadn't been careful, something that had moved with purpose. I reached down again, my fingers trembling, and touched the damp earth around the branch. The air was thick with the smell of wet wood and mud, and as I stood there, I realized I could hear something now, a faint sound, just beyond the rain. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It was the soft, steady sound of footsteps, too slow to deliberate, as if someone nor something was following me, pacing me through the forest. My blood ran cold. My eyes darted to the dark silhouettes of the trees, but I saw nothing. The footsteps continued, unyielding, and closer than I had thought. My instincts screamed at me to run, to flee into the darkness, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned in circles, desperately trying to locate the source of the sound. The forest had swallowed the path I had taken, and now I couldn't see anything through the dense fog and sheets of rain. I was lost, truly lost, and there, in the midst of it all, the footsteps were getting closer. I took one step, then another, my breath coming faster as the footsteps seemed to draw nearer. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, but all I could focus on was the overwhelming feeling that something was out there in the darkness, watching, waiting. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The forest fell silent. Only the storm remained. I held my breath, terrified that whatever had been following me was now waiting for me to make my next move. But I couldn't stay still. The fear gripped me so tightly that it was suffocating. I turned and ran, my legs moving without thought, pushing through the rain and mud, my heart beating wildly in my chest. I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. The footsteps, the broken branch, the eyes in the shadows, they were all closing in on me. I had to keep moving, even if it meant running blind into the storm. The storm seemed to roar louder as the darkness pressed in around me. I had lost track of time hours ago, but it felt like the world itself had turned against me. The rain came down in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees like an angry beast. Every step I took seemed heavier than the last, and my body felt like it was moving on instinct alone. Fear, exhaustion, and confusion had taken over my mind, but in the midst of all that chaos, something flickered in the distance. A light. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog was thick, and the world around me was a blur of shadows and rain, but through the mist, there it was faint, but undeniable. A soft glow, barely visible, but enough to make me wonder if it could be a sign. Could it be them? Could it be my family, waiting for me, just ahead in this storm? For a split second, doubt gnawed at me. It could be a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the fear and exhaustion that had begun to consume me. But no, there was something about it, something in the way the light flickered so steadily through the fog that made me feel like it was real. Hope ignited in my chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a spark of something other than fear. I couldn't remember when I had last felt hopeful, but in that moment, that light was everything. It was the promise of safety, of finding the ones I loved, of finally escaping the endless night that had swallowed me whole. I wiped the rain from my eyes and started running toward the light, my feet slipping and sliding in the mud, but I didn't care. I didn't think about how much longer I could keep going or how deep the storm had become. All that mattered was the light ahead. My heart raced, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and my entire body ached with exhaustion. But I pushed forward, faster and faster, the pounding of my feet drowned out by the sound of the rain hitting the ground like a relentless drum. The fog seemed to close in around me, thickening with each step, but the light was still there, pulling me in. I had to believe it was real. I had to believe that I wasn't alone in this storm, that my family hadn't disappeared into the darkness. Maybe they were waiting for me, just ahead. As I ran, I tried to make sense of the last few hours. What had happened to my family? Where had they gone? Had they been swept away by the storm, just like me? Or was it something worse? The wind screamed in my ears, drowning out my thoughts, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back. The light ahead was my only hope, and I couldn't let it slip away. With every step, the distance between me and the light seemed to shrink. I could feel the heat of it now, though it was still distant. Was it a lantern, a fire, or was it something else? I couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't lost, not if that light was real. The rain stung against my skin, soaking through my clothes, but it felt less important now. I had a purpose again, a reason to keep moving. The forest was a blur around me, the trees and branches bending and snapping in the storm, but I didn't look at them. I didn't have time to worry about anything but the flickering light ahead. I was getting closer. I could feel it. My legs burned. My breath came in shallow bursts, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. But then, just as I thought I was almost there, the light flickered, then vanished completely. The sudden darkness hit me like a blow. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled, trying to steady myself in the rain, but the light was gone. The fog swallowed it whole, as if it had never been there at all. I froze in place, panic flooding my veins. My eyes darted around, trying to find even the faintest trace of the glow. But there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of dark trees and swirling mist. No, 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 no. I shook my head, the disbelief heavy in my chest. I couldn't accept it. I had been so sure that the light was real, that I was almost there, that I would find my family. But now it was gone. My heart raced as fear clawed at my insides. Was I losing my mind? Was it a hallucination brought on by the storm? I didn't know, but the emptiness in my chest felt more real than anything else. I stood there for a long moment, my breath coming in quick, panicked bursts, listening to the rain and the wind and the silence that followed.
Yeah.
The light, whatever it was, had been a beacon, a reminder that I wasn't lost forever, that someone, somewhere, might be waiting for me. But now, I was back to square one, alone, in the storm, with nothing but the relentless rain and the darkness around me. I took a deep, shaky breath and wiped my face, trying to clear away the mist that clung to my skin. I couldn't let the light slipping away defeat me. I couldn't give in. I wasn't alone. My family, my people, had to be out there somewhere. I couldn't stop looking for them. I couldn't stop running. The storm wasn't over. The night wasn't done with me, but I would keep going, for them, for me, and I would find the light again. The storm hadn't let up. If anything, it had grown fiercer. The rain lashed against my skin, and the wind howled through the trees, making the forest feel alive with something I couldn't quite explain. I had been walking, or more accurately, stumbling, through the endless dark for what felt like hours. The trees were nothing but blurry shapes, their trunks bending in the wind, and the mist hung thick in the air, making everything feel far away, distant. I was growing tired, so tired. My legs ached with every step, my breath shallow and ragged. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to keep searching for my family, even though I wasn't sure I could hold on to the hope anymore. But there was something, a flicker of determination deep within me, pushing me to go on. As I tried to steady myself against the wind, I felt it. A cold touch, like fingers brushing against my arm. A chill that crawled under my skin and made my heart lurch in my chest. I froze, every muscle tensing in shock. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, everything seemed to go still, the rain and wind quieting as if the forest itself had paused in anticipation. I spun around, my eyes wide and searching the dark trees behind me, but there was no one, nothing. I stood there, my pulse hammering in my ears. What had I felt? The brush of fingers? The sensation had been so real, so vivid, that it was impossible to deny, but there was no one there. No trace of a figure, no movement in the trees. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself that it had just been the wind or the storm playing tricks on me, but something deep in my gut told me that wasn't it. Something wasn't right. I could still feel the lingering coldness on my skin, the sensation of an unseen touch, and it made my heart race faster. The rain had soaked through my clothes, and yet the chill I felt wasn't from the weather. It was different, like something was brushing up against me from somewhere far beyond the physical world. A shiver ran down my spine. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest felt more oppressive now, its shadows deeper, the air colder. It was as though something was watching me, something I couldn't see but could feel every time the wind gusted, every time the trees creaked. I was certain something was out there, just beyond my reach. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to take another step. But the darkness felt thicker now. The sounds of the storm were more menacing. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of the leaves felt like a warning. I kept moving, my feet slipping on the slick ground, trying to push the unsettling feeling out of my mind. But the sensation of being watched of something just behind me grew stronger. My heart was pounding, and every part of me screamed to stop, to turn back, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop searching, not now, not when I was so close. Suddenly, the wind picked up again, this time with a violent force. It pushed against my body, making me stagger, and in the midst of the chaos, I heard it. A faint whisper. It was impossible, my mind told me. The wind had been howling nonstop, drowning out any sound. But the whisper, it wasn't the wind. It was a voice soft, barely audible, but there it called my name. I froze once more, my body rigid with fear. No, I whispered to myself. It was the wind, it had to be. But then, again, the whisper. My name. I turned around quickly, spinning in place, but the forest was empty. The only sound was the roar of the storm around me. My heart thudded loudly in my chest, a rapid, frantic beat. My breath quickened, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I was losing my mind. The exhaustion, the fear it, was all clouding my judgment, making me hear things that weren't there. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The sensation of being watched, of something cold and unseen lingering just behind me. With trembling hands, I reached out, grasping a nearby tree for support, trying to steady myself. I was just so tired, so drained from hours of wandering through the storm, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't give up now. I had to keep searching. But the whispers, the cold touch, they were like a warning. Something was wrong, and every step I took seemed to lead me further into the storm, further into the unknown. My body screamed for rest, but I refused to listen. I couldn't stop moving. As the wind began to howl louder, I pressed forward, trying to push everything from my mind. But deep inside, I felt it. The strange fear that had gripped me since I had first lost sight of my family. That feeling of something watching from the shadows, something that wasn't just part of the storm. And as I walked on, the cold touch never truly left me. It lingered on my skin, as if waiting for me to turn around, waiting for me to find what was hidden in the darkness. I couldn't remember how long I had been walking. The storm had swallowed up everything around me time, space, my very sense of self. The wind whipped against my face, sharp and biting, and the rain pelted me like 1,000 needles, soaking through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. The cold had long since settled in, but it wasn't just the weather that made my body tremble. It was the emptiness. I pushed through the thick underbrush, each step feeling heavier than the last. And yet, despite the storm's fury, my mind drifted elsewhere, into memories that I hadn't realized I had buried so deep. I could almost hear their voices, my family. I could see us all sitting together around the table just a few days ago, laughing over dinner. The sound of my mother's gentle laughter, the way my father's voice always had that warm, comforting tone. I shut my eyes for a moment, just long enough to remember the way we all felt in that moment, the simple joy of being together. My younger sister, Sarah, had been telling one of her silly jokes, the kind that made no sense but always sent us all into fits of giggles. I could hear her in my mind now, her voice full of excitement, her words tumbling over one another in that way only she could do. It felt like a lifetime ago. My feet slipped in the mud, and I had to grab a nearby tree to steady myself. The feeling of their presence, their warmth, was so vivid in my memory that it almost felt like I was still with them. But the truth was harsh, cold, and undeniable. They were gone. I couldn't remember when we had last spoken. I couldn't remember the last time I heard my father's voice, or the last time I saw my mother smile. It had been hours, maybe longer, since I had last seen them, and the fog in my mind clouded the details. Were they still out there, somewhere in this storm? Were they looking for me too? But that thought only made my heart race faster. What if they weren't looking for me at all? What if, like me, they had lost their way? Or worse, what if they had disappeared entirely? The fear settled in deep, heavier than the storm itself. The empty space around me felt like an echo, amplifying the loneliness that crept into every corner of my mind. The storm raged on, but in my head I kept hearing their voices, faint and distant. The laughter, the warmth, the normalcy of that evening. I could almost see us again, sitting together, enjoying a quiet night before it all shattered, before the storm came. I couldn't hold back the tears. They slipped silently down my face, blending with the rain. My chest tightened, and I realized just how much I missed them, how much I needed them. The memory of their faces, their warmth, was slipping away, fading like a dream I couldn't grasp, no matter how hard I tried. And yet, as I stumbled through the forest, lost and alone, the memory of that night became a heavy weight on my chest. It was a reminder of everything I had lost, everything that had once been so real. Now drifting further out of reach with every step I took, I wiped my eyes, but it didn't help. I felt small, insignificant, as if I were nothing more than a passing shadow in this vast, unfeeling storm. The trees around me seemed to loom larger now, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, as if the forest itself were pulling me deeper into its darkness. But then, in the midst of my fear and confusion, something inside me stirred. It wasn't the storm, or the strange whispers that had begun to echo through the trees. It wasn't the cold touch that had brushed against my skin, or the feeling of being watched. No, it was the memory of their love, the bond that tied us together. And even though I couldn't remember the last time we spoke, I knew deep down, without question, that they hadn't abandoned me. They couldn't have. In the dark of that storm, in the deepest part of the forest, I realized that they would never leave me behind. Not truly. And that thought, small but powerful, was enough to push me forward. I couldn't stop searching, couldn't stop moving. The storm had taken everything from me, but it wouldn't take my hope. I took a shaky breath and wiped away the last of my tears. The rain continued to fall, and the wind howled louder than ever, but I wasn't listening to the storm anymore. Instead, I listened for the sound of their voices. I listened for that faint, comforting laughter, and I kept moving. The rain pounded relentlessly against the forest, a steady roar that masked all sound, save for the occasional crack of thunder overhead. I had been walking for what felt like an eternity, my feet numb from the cold and my body aching from the endless journey through the storm. The wind howled through the trees, whipping the branches violently as if the forest itself was alive, angry and unforgiving. I had lost track of time, no sense of day or night remained in this endless downpour. I hadn't seen another soul in hours, and the emptiness around me was suffocating. The world had become a blurred canvas of gray and black, as if the storm had erased all color, all life, and all hope. But then, just as I thought the silence would consume me, a sound broke through, a soft, muffled sob, barely audible over the storm's rage. It was so faint that I almost convinced myself it wasn't real, that the wind was playing tricks on me. But then it came again, a quiet whimper, a helpless, sorrowful sound that made my blood run cold. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen. The forest, with all its fury, seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath, waiting. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was crying not far away. For a moment I just stood there, unsure of what to do. I was alone in this storm, lost and terrified. The idea of finding someone, another lost soul perhaps, should have filled me with relief, but instead, a creeping fear settled over me. Who could it be? Was it someone else who had lost their way? Or was it something else? The storm had already played enough tricks on my mind. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the dark silhouettes of trees, trying to catch any movement, any sign of life. The fog had thickened again, making it hard to see anything beyond a few feet. But the sobs, faint but real, continued to echo through the trees, pulling me forward. I hesitated, feeling the weight of my uncertainty. Could it be a trick of the storm? The wind carrying a sound that was twisted, distorted by the raging elements? I couldn't afford to waste time. I needed to find my family, and every second felt like an eternity. But the cry, so real, so heart-wrenching, gnawed at me. I had to know. I took a deep breath, my body trembling as I stepped carefully in the direction of the sound. The rain was relentless, blurring everything around me, but I couldn't ignore the pull in my chest. The cries grew louder, clearer, and I could feel my heart race. It sounded so familiar, like the soft whimper of a child. Was it my sister, Sarah? Could she be out here, lost in the same storm? I forced my feet to move, though my legs felt as though they were made of stone. Every step seemed to take forever, the mud and debris beneath my shoes threatening to trip me at any moment. I reached out, my hands brushing against the wet bark of the trees for support. My breathing became shallow, a mixture of hope and fear flooding my chest, as the sobs grew even closer. And then, just as quickly as they had started, the cries stopped. A heavy silence settled over the forest. My pulse thudded in my ears, and the sound of the rain seemed to fade into the background as I stood there, frozen. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, any clue that someone was near, but there was nothing. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my mind raced with questions. Had I imagined it? Had the storm tricked me again? But the memory of that soft, sorrowful cry lingered in the air like a ghost. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. I had heard it, and it was real. I turned in a circle, desperate to find the source. The rain blurred my vision, and the fog clung to the trees, making the forest feel like a labyrinth of shadows. Every step I took seemed to carry me deeper into the unknown, but I couldn't go back, not yet, not without answers. I shouted out, my voice cracking under the weight of my fear. "Hello, is anyone there?" But there was no response, no echo of my voice, just the wind and the storm, and the feeling of being utterly alone. I had to move forward, I told myself. There was no time to waste. But the sobs? Was it a lost child, a soul who had wandered as I had? Or was it something more sinister, a presence in the storm that sought to trap me, to lead me astray? I didn't know, but the question lingered as I took another step into the forest, the fog swallowing me whole. The storm was still raging, but somewhere, in the depths of that darkness, I felt the weight of my own sorrow, mixed with an inexplicable sense of fear. Who or what had made that sound? And was I walking deeper into danger with each step I took? The wind howled louder, and the rain seemed to fall in sheets, blurring everything in its path. Each drop felt like an icy needle against my skin as I trudged forward, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. The forest was eerily quiet again, save for the occasional rustle of the trees, swaying violently as if trying to speak in a language I couldn't understand. My heart was still racing from the sobs I had heard, and every step felt heavier than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in my chest. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the storm itself was trying to swallow me whole. And yet, I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. I had to find them, my family. They couldn't be far. They had to be out here somewhere, waiting for me. But the sobs, the unmistakable sound of someone crying, still echoed in my mind. It hadn't been a figment of my imagination. I was certain of it. Someone or something had been out there, just beyond my reach. I had to find them. I pushed through the thick mist and the heavy brush, my hands trembling as they reached out to steady myself against the trunks of the trees. The ground beneath my feet was slippery, my shoes barely able to grip the wet earth, and every so often I would lose my footing and stumble. It felt like I had been walking for hours, yet no matter how far I went, the darkness only seemed to deepen. The storm had swallowed everything: my thoughts, my hope, even the very sound of my footsteps seemed to be lost in the wind. I stopped again, this time without realizing it. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stood still in the downpour. I thought I heard something, a faint sound, like the soft shuffle of feet in the wet mud. I held my breath, my senses on high alert. Was it the wind, or was someone out there? Was it my family? "Hello," I called, my voice hoarse and raw from the strain. There was no answer, only the relentless roar of the storm. I waited, and the silence stretched on, each second heavier than the last. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. For a moment, I thought I imagined it the sound that had drawn me forward earlier. But then, once more, I heard the sobs. Louder now, almost as if they were directly behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping in my chest. The rain blurred my vision, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just a few feet away, tall, shadowed, and unmoving. But when I blinked, the figure was gone, swallowed up by the storm. I took a step back, my body tensing with a primal fear. There was something wrong. The sobs hadn't stopped. They were closer now, but I couldn't see where they were coming from. The air around me felt colder, a chill creeping into my bones despite the storm's warmth. "Who's there?" I called again, my voice shaking. No answer came, only the soft rustle of the wind moving through the branches. My pulse quickened. The sobs were growing louder, but they didn't sound right. They weren't the sobs of a lost child or a person in distress. No, they were deeper, almost guttural, as if something or someone was mimicking the sound. Playing with my mind, I turned again, my breath coming fast as panic gripped me. I had to find out what was happening, what was causing the sound. My instincts told me to keep moving, to find shelter, but the part of me that still clung to hope, the part that believed I could still find my family, drove me onward. The storm had a way of erasing everything around me. The trees were now mere silhouettes, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, their shadows twisting in unnatural shapes. The world had become a blur of gray, familiar yet foreign. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it again, the soft, mournful sob, this time directly behind me. My heart dropped into my stomach. I spun around, but the forest was empty. Nothing was there. I couldn't breathe. A cold sweat clung to my skin, despite the relentless rain. I staggered back, stumbling over a fallen branch, my legs weak and shaking. The sobs continued, but there was no one in sight. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape, to go back to where I had started, to forget this entire nightmare. But the storm wouldn't let me. The forest had become a labyrinth, each turn leading me deeper into the unknown. In that moment, I realized something chilling that froze me in place. The sobs I had been hearing weren't human. They were too distorted, too unnatural. It wasn't a lost soul I was chasing. It wasn't my family. It was something else, something far more sinister. Something that had been waiting for me, drawing me in with its cries. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stood there, trembling, the reality of the situation crashing over me. I was alone in this storm, lost not only in the forest, but in something far darker. The forest whispered around me, the wind carrying voices that weren't mine. I was no longer sure if the storm was playing tricks on my mind, or if I had stepped into something I couldn't understand, something I couldn't escape. The rain had turned from a steady downpour to a torrential surge, the kind that made the forest feel like it was drowning in itself. My feet sank deeper into the wet earth with each step I took, but I pushed forward. I had to, there was no choice. But as I moved through the tangled undergrowth, something strange began to happen. The path that had seemed so clear just moments ago was gone. I stopped and blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A thick wall of branches and vines now blocked my way, twisting together in an almost unnatural way. The trees loomed overhead, their bark slick with rain, their branches hanging like gnarled hands reaching for me. The forest felt different now, the air heavier, the atmosphere suffocating. It was as if the land itself had shifted, swallowing up any trace of the trail I had been following. The path, ... Where had it gone? I turned around, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the way I had come might still be visible. But no, nothing. Just more trees, more fog, more shadows. The storm raged on around me, but it felt distant now, almost muted, as if it too had been swallowed by this strange, oppressive space. I swallowed hard, a wave of panic rising in my chest. My family, I had to find them. My mind screamed at me to keep moving, to keep searching, but with each step forward, the sense of direction slipped further away from me. I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, as though the earth itself were trying to pull me down into some hidden abyss. A cold chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just the rain or the wind that had me feeling like this. There was something else, a presence, an unsettling energy that seemed to pulse in the air around me. The sobs I had heard earlier still echoed in my mind, a reminder of how close I had been to something, or someone. But now, in this part of the forest, there was nothing, only the overwhelming silence of an unseen force. I pushed through the tangled branches, the rain slashing against my skin, but it felt futile. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into this impossible maze of trees and shadows. The path was gone, replaced by a suffocating emptiness. Suddenly, the ground beneath me seemed to give way, and I stumbled forward, my hands grabbing at the nearest tree for balance. My heart raced, and the taste of fear lingered in my throat. I was trapped. The forest had become a labyrinth, and I didn't know which way to go. I could feel my pulse in my temples, the pounding of my heart growing louder, drowning out everything else. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of wet leaves and something ... older, something that didn't belong to the storm. My mind raced, memories of my family flashing through my thoughts. My father's reassuring voice, my mother's warm touch, my sister's laughter. They were all so distant now, fading with each passing second. Had I been walking in circles, or was I simply losing my mind? I turned once again, desperately searching for any sign of the trail. But nothing but trees and branches and endless rain. My body felt weak, my mind unraveling in the face of this growing terror. I couldn't breathe. I had lost my way. I was alone, and the path that had led me here, it had vanished. I took a step forward, my shoes slipping in the mud, and then another. The forest was oppressive now, closing in on me. It felt as though the very trees were watching, waiting. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, as I stumbled through the underbrush. It was harder to see through the rain, harder to feel the ground beneath my feet. The storm wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside me, consuming me. The air felt colder now, so cold that my breath fogged in front of me despite the humidity. Was it the storm, or something else, something more ... sinister? I couldn't stay still. But moving, I realized, didn't seem to help either. I wasn't getting anywhere. It was at that moment I felt it again, the same sensation from earlier, the one that had brushed against my arm. A cold, wet touch, like fingers reaching out from the darkness. I froze, my skin prickling with the sudden realization that I wasn't alone. I spun around, expecting to see something or someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the storm, the cold rain, the empty forest, my breath caught in my throat. Was it my imagination playing tricks on me? Or had I felt something, someone, there? I took another step, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to shake off the feeling. There was no path anymore, just endless trees, endless shadows, endless silence, and no way out. The storm had become a cacophony of noise, each raindrop crashing against the earth like 1,000 tiny hammers. The trees, once towering and firm, now bent low under the weight of the wind, their branches twisting and snapping in the violent gusts. I couldn't escape the relentless pounding of the rain. It soaked through my clothes, chilled my bones, and filled my thoughts with a suffocating fog of panic. I had long since lost my sense of direction. The path, the forest, the world around me, everything had become a blur. But there was nothing to guide me, nothing to hold on to. The storm had swallowed everything. I stopped again, gasping for breath, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a deep, paralyzing sense of dread. The forest around me had become a living, breathing thing, and I was no longer sure if it was trying to help me find my way, or if it was actively trying to keep me lost. There was no path anymore, just endless trees, endless shadows, endless silence, and no way out. The storm had become a cacophony of noise, each raindrop crashing against the earth like 1,000 tiny hammers. The trees, once towering and firm, now bent low under the weight of the wind, their branches twisting and snapping in the violent gusts. I couldn't escape the relentless pounding of the rain. It soaked through my clothes, chilled my bones, and filled my thoughts with a suffocating fog of panic. I had long since lost my sense of direction. The path, the forest, the world around me, everything had become a blur. It sounded so close, and yet, when I looked around, all I saw was the unyielding blur of the storm. The call was both a lifeline and a trap. My feet began to move before I could stop them, my body instinctively running toward the sound, toward the voice that could be my family or someone who needed help. But as I ran, something felt wrong. My feet caked in mud and waterlogged shoes seemed to drag with every step. I was moving, but the ground felt like it was holding me back. The rain was falling harder now, pouring down in sheets, blurring everything around me. The voice came again, louder this time, more desperate, as if it were trying to reach me through the storm's fury. My heart skipped a beat. It was my name, but it didn't sound like it belonged to me. It sounded distant, distorted, as if it had been twisted by the wind itself. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Was someone else out here? Had someone else gotten lost, just like I had? The thought should have filled me with hope, with relief. But it didn't. The voice had an eerie quality to it, like a shadow of the past that had somehow found its way into the present. Emily, please, The voice called again, this time more urgent, as though it were begging. It was so familiar, and yet so wrong. I couldn't place it, couldn't find its origin, but there was something in its something that gnawed at my insides. I glanced around, my eyes wild with panic. The trees, the thick fog, the endless rain, everything was closing in on me. Was it my mind playing tricks on me, or was someone really out there calling my name? My legs felt heavy, weighed down by the mud, as if the earth itself was trying to keep me from moving. The voice echoed again, louder now, and I felt my heart beat faster. It sounded so close, and yet, when I looked around, all I saw was the unyielding blur of the storm. The call was both a lifeline and a trap. My feet began to move before I could stop them, my body instinctively running toward the sound, toward the voice that could be my family or someone who needed help. But as I ran, something felt wrong. My feet, caked in mud and waterlogged shoes, seemed to drag with every step. I was moving, but the ground felt like it was holding me back. The rain was falling harder now, pouring down in sheets, blurring everything around me. The wind howled in my ears, drowning out everything else, but still, I could hear that voice calling my name, desperate and pleading. Emily, ... hurry. I pushed forward, my breath shallow, my heart racing as I tried to follow the voice. But with every step I took, it felt like the distance between us grew wider. My legs burned, each stride feeling heavier than the last, and yet, the voice never seemed to move. It stayed the same, calling me forward, drawing me deeper into the storm. I stopped for a moment, gasping for breath, my head spinning as the world around me seemed to shift. The trees, the branches, the ground, all of it seemed to be bending and twisting, like I was walking in a dream, or worse, a nightmare. And in that moment, I realized, the voice, the call, it was no longer a apply it, was an order. Emily, ... come to me, ... I stumbled backward, my heart sinking as the realization hit me. This wasn't my family. It wasn't someone lost like I was. It was something else. Something that had taken my family's voice and twisted it into a thing I didn't recognize. I glanced around, but the fog had thickened so quickly I could barely make out the shadows of the trees surrounding me. The world had become a blur of gray and dark outlines, a vision both distorted and suffocating. But what truly made the air heavy wasn't just the storm, it was the stillness. There was no sound, no movement, no life. The wind may have been roaring, but everything else, everything I had once known in the forest, had gone silent. It was no longer my name it was calling. It was something darker, something twisted, and I was no longer sure if it was something I should be running toward or away from. The forest around me seemed to come alive, the wind picking up, bending the trees in unnatural ways, as if they were trying to point me in the direction of the voice. I could feel my legs trembling, my feet sinking deeper into the mud, the storm roaring in my ears. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn away. And that's when I heard it. A faint, distant echo, another cry. This one even softer, more vulnerable. It was my sister's voice. Emily ... I spun around, the sound of her voice pulling at my heart. But no, it wasn't right. She wasn't out here. She couldn't be. She had to be back home, safe. Still, the voice echoed again. And this time, I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It was all around me. My mind raced, my chest tightening as the rain poured down even harder, each drop like a slap against my skin. Emily ... I was caught, trapped in a storm that wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside me, in my mind, pulling me deeper into the forest, deeper into the unknown. And just as the voice reached its crescendo, a deafening silence took over. The call ... stopped, and I was left standing, alone in the dark, in the rain, with nothing but the storm to keep me company. But I could feel it, the pull. The storm wasn't the only thing I had to escape. The wind had shifted, becoming something far more sinister than the natural gusts I had felt earlier. It no longer just whipped through the trees or howled in the distance. It roared. It wasn't just the sound that unsettled MIT, was the weight of it. The way the wind seemed to press against my chest, as if it were trying to push me back, hold me in place. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat as a deep, guttural growl of wind echoed through the trees. The rain fell in sheets, soaking through my clothes. But it was the scent that clung to the air now that truly made my skin crawl. It was unlike any smell I'd ever encountered, sharp and pungent, like wet earth mixed with something bitter, something unnatural. My mind raced, trying to place it, but the longer I stood in the clearing, the more it felt as though the storm itself was not only watching me, but circling me. I glanced around, but the fog had thickened so quickly, I could barely make out the shadows of the trees surrounding me. The world had become a blur of gray and dark outlines, a vision both distorted and suffocating. But what truly made the air heavy wasn't just the storm, it was the stillness. There was no sound, no movement, no life. The wind may have been roaring, but everything else, everything I had once known in the forest, had gone silent. The creatures, even the occasional distant rumble of thunder, it was all gone, replaced by this oppressive stillness. I felt it in my bones, the absence of life, as though the storm had erased every living thing from the earth, leaving nothing behind but me and the relentless wind. I shook my head, trying to push away the panic that was creeping up my spine. This couldn't be right. I had to keep moving. My family had to be out there somewhere, waiting for me. I couldn't afford to be frozen by the terror the storm seemed to be feeding on. And yet, as I took a step forward, I felt the full weight of the wind press down on me. It was as if the forest itself had become an inescapable cage, the trees leaning inward, forcing me to stay in this place. My legs felt heavy, like I was walking through thick mud, my feet sinking with each step. But the strangest sensation was the feeling of being watched. I stopped again, my breath shallow. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the weight of eyes upon me, hidden just beyond the veil of mist and rain. My heart raced, each thud in my chest deafening against the silence. The wind had shifted, becoming something far more sinister than the natural gusts I had felt earlier. It no longer just whipped through the trees or howled in the distance. It roared. It wasn't just the sound that unsettled me, was the weight of it. The way the wind seemed to press against my chest, as if it were trying to push me back, hold me in place. The wind howled again, louder this time, and with it came a shrill whistle that scraped against my ears. It wasn't natural, this wind, I realized. It didn't carry the normal sense of rain and earth. It carried something more, something rancid, something wrong. The smell burned my nostrils, the air thick and suffocating as I gasped for breath. I spun around, desperate for a sign, for any clue that would lead me back to the path. But all I could see were the shadows, twisted and dark, pressing in from all sides. The storm was no longer just an event. It had become an entity, alive and malevolent. It felt as if it had grown aware of my presence, aware that I was here, lost and alone, trapped in its grip. A strange voice, distant but clear, echoed through the trees. It wasn't a human voice, not exactly, but a low guttural whisper that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It called my name, a rasping sound that chilled me to the core. Emily. The voice was haunting, so familiar yet foreign at the same time, like a dream slipping just beyond reach. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears, the wind carrying the whisper until it was lost in the storm's fury. It wasn't my mother. It wasn't anyone I knew, but I couldn't help the chill that spread through me. Couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was had been watching me for far longer than I'd realized. I had no idea where it had come from or how it had found me, but the realization hit me harder than the rain that pelted against my skin. I wasn't just walking through a storm. I was walking through something far more sinister. The feeling of being watched, of being pursued by something I couldn't see, pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I took a step forward. I had to move, had to keep going, but every part of me screamed to stop. But the storm had other plans. The wind howled again, louder this time, the trees groaning under its pressure. It felt like the very forest itself was trying to swallow me whole, trying to push me into a place where no one would ever find me. And as I moved deeper into the shadows, I couldn't help but wonder, was the storm trying to lead me somewhere? Or was it trying to bury me, just another lost soul, swallowed by the rage of something far older than I could imagine. I couldn't stop. Not yet. But I knew deep down, with a certainty that made my skin crawl, that the storm wasn't just a force of nature. It had become something else. Something alive. And it was waiting for me to make the wrong move. The rain had slowed slightly, but the storm was far from over. The wind still howled through the trees, and the scent of wet earth and something else, something foreign, lingered in the air. The world around me felt as if it had become entirely unrecognizable. The forest that I had once known, the paths that I had walked with my family, had all been erased, swallowed up by the endless downpour. Everything seemed wrong, as if the very landscape had been altered by the storm's wrath. I pressed on, my heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Each step felt like a struggle against the world itself, as if the earth itself was shifting beneath me. I couldn't tell how long I had been walking anymore. Time had lost all meaning. The only thing that mattered was finding a way out, finding my family. Then, as if pulled by an unseen force, my eyes landed on something unusual. Behind a thick veil of ivy that clung to the side of a moss-covered rock, there was a narrow gap, hand opening that had been hidden by nature's overgrowth. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was as though the forest had been hiding something from me, waiting for me to find it. I stepped closer, my hand instinctively reaching out toward the ivy. The moisture on the leaves soaked into my skin as I gently pulled them aside, revealing a narrow passage that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. The air around me shifted, growing colder. It wasn't just the storm's chill, it was the feeling that something was pulling me toward this passage. The path was dark, the shadows of the trees swallowing it whole, but I could see enough to know that it was a trail, an old, abandoned one. The ground was rough, uneven, but it was a path nonetheless. My heart raced. Could this be the way out? Could this be the answer I had been searching for? I wanted to believe it. I took a step forward, then another, my legs feeling like lead beneath me. I had to move, had to keep going, but every part of me screamed to stop. But the storm had other plans. The wind howled again, louder this time, the trees groaning under its pressure. It felt like the very forest itself was trying to swallow me whole, trying to push me into a place where no one would ever find me. And as I moved deeper into the shadows, I couldn't help but wonder, was the storm trying to lead me somewhere? Or was it trying to bury me, just another lost soul, swallowed by the rage of something far older than I could imagine? The distant sound of the wind, the storm, the thunder, it all seemed muffled, as if the forest itself had gone silent, watching me. The passage felt ancient, forgotten by time, and yet it seemed to be beckoning me forward. There was no sign of danger immediately. No one was waiting there to stop me, and yet the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I glanced down the dark trail. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, crept over me again. It was more than just the storm or the empty woods. It was as if something unseen was standing at the edge of the passage, waiting for me to make a move. A voice, soft but clear, whispered through the trees, carrying on the wind like a promise or a warning. Emily, ... I jumped, the sound of my name pulling me from my thoughts. The voice, though familiar, sent a chill down my spine. The ivy closed behind me, and the world outside seemed to vanish in an instant, the trees now a distant memory. I could still hear the storm raging outside, but it felt muffled, as if the trees themselves were blocking it out, enclosing me in this eerie tunnel. The air grew colder as I moved forward, the shadows of the trees stretching and twisting, making it hard to tell where the path led. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled forward, unsure of where this path would take me. The wind seemed to follow me, its howl growing more intense, more desperate, as if urging me to keep going. I turned back toward the passage, my hands still resting on the ivy that now felt cold against my fingertips. I could feel the rain beginning to pick up again, the sky darkening even more. The passage before me was still hidden, secret, and I was drawn to it despite the unsettling sensation in the pit of my stomach. It was a bird, I thought, or something like it, a creature whose wings sliced through the air with a grace that was nothing short of horrifying. Yet, the forest was silent once more, as if the bird had never been there at all. I swallowed hard, the taste of fear bitter in my mouth. The cry was loud, shrill, and full of such terror that it felt as though it was coming from within my own soul. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the sound echoed through the trees. My eyes instinctively darted upward, searching for the source of the noise. But the canopy above me was thick, and I could see nothing. The world felt like it was closing in around me, and that terrible cry lingered in my ears, making my skin crawl. The wind carried the screech again, sharper this time, and I could almost feel the vibrations in the air. Or was it warning me? I took another step, my legs heavy, the ground uneven beneath me. The passage narrowed further, and I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in from all sides. It was as if the trees themselves were closing in, their limbs reaching toward me, pulling me deeper into the unknown. Was this the path to my family, or was this the road to something darker, something that would pull me further away from the world I knew? I didn't know, but the path before me was the only choice I had. I had to keep moving forward. I had no other option. I had to find my family, even if it meant stepping into a place where danger and uncertainty waited around every corner. And so, with the sound of the storm still howling outside, I stepped deeper into the hidden passage, unsure of what I would find at the end, but knowing one thing for certain: I couldn't stop now. The narrow passage had grown even darker, the trees now towering above me like silent sentinels, their branches interlacing to block out whatever faint light the storm had allowed to filter through. Each step I took seemed to echo in the stillness, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The rain had begun again, a relentless downpour that turned the trail beneath my feet into a muddy, slippery mess. My heart was heavy with the weight of uncertainty, but I pressed on, the sound of my footsteps mixing with the distant rumble of thunder. Suddenly, a screech cut through the air, a piercing, unnatural sound that sent a chill racing down my spine. The cry was loud, shrill, and full of such terror that it felt as though it was coming from within my own soul. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the sound echoed through the trees. My eyes instinctively darted upward, searching for the source of the noise. But the canopy above me was thick, and I could see nothing. The world felt like it was closing in around me, and that terrible cry lingered in my ears, making my skin crawl. The wind carried the screech again, sharper this time, and I could almost feel the vibrations in the air. It was a bird, I thought, or something like it, a creature whose wings sliced through the air with a grace that was nothing short of horrifying. Yet, as I stood there, straining my eyes against the darkness, there was nothing. The trees were still. The forest was silent once more, as if the bird had never been there at all. I swallowed hard, the taste of fear bitter in my mouth. The wind stopped howling. The rain ceased its relentless pounding on the trees and the earth. Everything was still, too still. It was as though the world had decided to hold its breath, and in that eerie silence, I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat in my chest. It was so loud, so frantic, that it seemed to fill the entire world around me, drowning out everything else. I stood frozen in place, unsure of what to make of the sudden quiet. The absence of sound was more unnerving than the storm had been. Where had the wind gone? Where was the pattering of rain against the leaves, the ground, the trees? The call was almost human, if it weren't for the horrible guttural sound that accompanied it, like an animal's cry trapped in the throat of a person. I could almost feel its desperation, its fear. I took another step forward, though my legs felt as if they were made of stone. Each breath was shallow. my chest tightening with every beat of my heart. I had to move, had to keep going, but the sound it wouldn't leave me alone. It wrapped around me, echoing in my ears like the distant whisper of a ghost. Something wasn't right. I could feel it, deep in my bones. The storm itself seemed to conspire against me, its fury hiding the truth of the world around me. The wind seemed to whisper in my ear, a constant low hum that I couldn't quite decipher, but that I could feel deep within my chest. The bird's cry had only heightened that sense, as if it were a cyan omen I could not ignore. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I couldn't afford to let fear rule me now. Not when I was so close to finding my family. I had to stay focused, I reminded myself. I had to find them. And yet, as I took a few more steps into the passage, the screeching cries seemed to follow me. It was distant now, but still present, lingering in the back of my mind like a warning I couldn't shake. Each time I moved, I expected to see the creature that had made the sound, but there was nothing. No bird, no sign of life, only the stillness and the storm. I glanced behind me, the passage I had entered feeling more like a trap with each passing second. The thick ivy that had once hidden the entrance now felt like a barrier, closing me off from the world I had known. Had I made a mistake? Was this passage leading me deeper into danger rather than closer to the safety I so desperately sought? The screech came again, this time louder, closer. The wind carried it to me on the edge of the storm's fury, its source still hidden from my sight. My heart hammered in my chest, my body tensing, ready to bolt in any direction to escape the feeling that something or someone was drawing near. The call was almost human, if it weren't for the horrible guttural sound that accompanied it, like an animal's cry trapped in the throat of a person. I could almost feel its desperation, its fear. I took another step forward, though my legs felt as if they were made of stone. Each breath was shallow, my chest tightening with every beat of my heart. I had to move, had to keep going, but the sound it wouldn't leave me alone. It wrapped around me, echoing in my ears like the distant whisper of a ghost. Something wasn't right. I could feel it, deep in my bones. The passage seemed to narrow even more as I walked, the trees closing in on me with every step. The air grew colder, the dampness settling into my skin. I could no longer tell where the sound of the bird ended and the storm began. It was as if they had become one unholy union of nature's fury and the unnatural cry that now haunted me. I stopped again, my feet slipping on the wet ground as I stood in the middle of the passage. My breath was ragged, my pulse racing as I fought the panic rising in my chest. I needed to keep moving, but I was paralyzed by fear, unsure of what lay ahead. Was this path the right one? Was it leading me to my family, or deeper into the storm's grip, where no one could find me? The screech of the bird came once more, and I could feel the weight of it pressing on me, closing in on my mind, my heart. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a bird's cry, it was something more. It was a warning, and I couldn't understand it. It was as though the storm, the forest, the very earth around me was trying to tell me something that I wasn't meant to know. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as best I could. I had no choice but to keep moving forward. I had to find my family, even if the path ahead seemed swallowed by darkness. The screech echoed again, and I knew, with an unsettling certainty, that it was a sound I would never forget. It would follow me, haunting me long after the storm had passed. The storm, which had been raging with such ferocity just moments ago, suddenly fell silent. The wind stopped howling, the rain ceased its relentless pounding on the trees and the earth. Everything was still, too still. It was as though the world had decided to hold its breath, and in that eerie silence, I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat in my chest. It was so loud, so frantic, that it seemed to fill the entire world around me, drowning out everything else. I stood frozen in place, unsure of what to make of the sudden quiet. The absence of sound was more unnerving than the storm had been. Where had the wind gone? Where was the pattering of rain against the leaves, the ground, the trees? My heart was racing, but I could still hear its beat echoing in my chest, louder than the storm, louder than the wind. The forest had come alive again, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something or someone was still out there, waiting. And somewhere deep in the woods, I could almost hear my name being called again, just beyond the reach of the storm. The storm had reached a new level of intensity, as if the sky itself was on the verge of collapsing. The absence of sound seemed to amplify the feeling of isolation, the gnawing fear that had been building inside me since I first set foot in this cursed forest. It was as though the storm had gone silent on purpose, as though it was waiting for something or someone. The fog, which had been swirling around the forest only moments earlier, had vanished as well, leaving the world in sharp focus, but still strangely empty. My breath hitched in my throat as the quiet began to press in on me. It felt unnatural, wrong even. Nature had never been this silent, not even in the deepest parts of the woods, not even when the storm was at its worst. The absence of sound seemed to amplify the feeling of isolation, the gnawing fear that had been building inside me since I first set foot in this cursed forest. It was as though the storm had gone silent on purpose, as though it was waiting for something or someone. The air around me felt charged, like the calm before a storm, but with no storm to follow. I could hear every breath I took, every heartbeat that thundered in my chest. The silence made it feel like I was the only thing left in the world, the only living thing to witness the quiet that had fallen over everything. In that moment, my mind flashed back to earlier, to the cries I had heard, the whisper of something watching me, the screech of the bird, the murmur of voices in the wind. Was this silence just another part of the storm's cruel tricks? Was it waiting to draw me deeper into the forest, to trap me in a place where no one could find me? I took a hesitant step forward, my feet feeling heavier with each movement. It was as if the earth itself was unwilling to let me go. The air was thick, damp, and suffocating, pressing against my skin like a heavy blanket. I was suddenly aware of the cold, the chill creeping into my bones, and the sensation of someone watching me. I could feel my pulse racing, and yet, in the silence, it felt like my own body was betraying me, betraying the calm that had taken over the forest. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound at all, but there was nothing. I called out, my voice breaking the quiet, but it felt so small, so insignificant in the vast emptiness around me. No echo, no response, only the stillness and the heaviness of the air. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling, but it was swallowed whole by the silence. There was no wind to carry my words, no trees to rustle in reply, just the oppressive quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. I felt my body grow heavier, as if the silence itself was weighing me down. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Had I imagined the storm, the birds' screech, the footsteps I thought I heard following me? Was this forest playing tricks on me, or had I truly wandered into a place where no living thing was allowed to remain? I reached down, gripping the mud-soaked ground beneath my feet, as though trying to steady myself. The darkness had thickened, and though I could see everything around me, it felt like the world had become a mere shadow, a twisted reflection of the place it used to be. The silence pressed on, thick and suffocating, and I couldn't escape it, couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had fallen, the silence was broken. A gust of wind swept through the trees, shaking the branches, and the rain began to fall again. A soft drizzle at first, before quickly building back into the storm's previous fury. But the damage had been done. The quiet had lodged itself deep inside me, an unsettling presence that I couldn't shake, no matter how loud the storm became. I had never felt more alone in my life. As the rain began to fall in earnest once more, I found myself standing there, caught between the storm's chaos and the suffocating quiet I had just experienced. My heart was racing, but I could still hear its beat echoing in my chest, louder than the storm, louder than the wind. The forest had come alive again, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something or someone was still out there, waiting. And somewhere deep in the woods, I could almost hear my name being called again, just beyond the reach of the storm. The storm had reached a new level of intensity, as if the sky itself was on the verge of collapsing. The rain, thick and heavy, fell in torrents, washing everything in a relentless blur of gray. The wind had returned, howling through the trees, its fury seemingly endless. I could feel it, that cold bite in the air, the kind that sinks deep into your bones and makes you question whether you'll ever feel warm again. I pressed forward, step after step, my feet sinking into the mud, the sounds of the forest distorted by the storm. But then, something happened. A flash of light, brilliant and blinding, split the sky in two. The thunder followed immediately, a deep, resonant roar that rattled the very ground beneath my feet. But in that brief moment of illumination, I saw something that made my heart stop. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the half-light, stood a figure. The lightning had cast a ghostly glow over everything, and for that split second, I thought I recognized her, my mother. Her silhouette was unmistakable, though the features were blurred, distorted by the storm and the darkness that immediately swallowed her up again. My heart skipped, a jolt of hope surging through me. Could it be her? Could I have finally found someone? Finally found her? My body moved on its own, a desperate need driving me forward, my legs heavy but determined. "Mom," I called out, my voice barely rising above the storm's roar. But my voice was swallowed up by the wind before it could reach her. The figure didn't move, standing there in the rain, just out of reach, as if waiting for something. A familiar warmth spread through me, hope, relief, the sensation of safety that I had longed for, but it was short-lived. Before I could take another step, the lightning faded, the world plunging back into darkness. And when my eyes adjusted to the dim, rain-soaked landscape again, the figure was gone. There was nothing there but the howling wind and the relentless rain. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where she had been, hoping against reason that she would appear again, that the storm had somehow tricked me into thinking I had seen what I did. The rain, thick and heavy, fell in torrents, washing everything in a relentless blur of gray. The wind had returned, howling through the trees, its fury seemingly endless. I could feel it, that cold bite in the air, the kind that sinks deep into your bones and makes you question whether you'll ever feel warm again. I pressed forward, step after step, my feet sinking into the mud, the sounds of the forest distorted by the storm. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The question gnawed at me, tearing at my resolve. My mind screamed that it couldn't have been her. It was impossible. But there was a part of me deep hidden that couldn't let go of the image of that figure, standing just out of reach, waiting. With a shaky breath, I tried to push the thought away. There was no time to dwell on ghosts, no time to second-guess myself. I had to find my family, had to keep moving. The storm was unrelenting, and every moment felt like a race against time. But as I took a step forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching me. The silence that had once enveloped me now seemed even more suffocating, and the storm's rage only added to the sense of danger closing in around me. I called out again, louder this time, my voice raw and desperate. "Mom, Sarah." My words were lost to the wind, but the feeling of being heard, of reaching someone, lingered in my chest. I moved forward, determined, but each step felt heavier than the last. The rain had soaked me through, my clothes clinging to my skin, but it was the cold in my bones that made it impossible to shake the sensation of dread that had taken root inside me. Another flash of lightning illuminated the forest, and once again, I thought I saw her. For just a moment, there was a figure, standing in the distance familiar, yet just out of reach. It was almost as if she was there and then gone before I could truly believe it. I called again, but this time no sound came from my throat. Only the crackle of the storm, only the deafening silence that followed. I took another step, my heart pounding. The image of the figure was still in my mind, haunting me. Was it my mother, or had I simply lost my grip on reality? Had the storm twisted everything I knew, bending it until the line between truth and delusion was blurred beyond recognition? The wind howled louder now, as though it knew my thoughts, knew my fear. It was mocking me, urging me to give in, to stop searching, to stop believing. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop now. I had to find them. I had to know. I forced myself to keep moving, the heavy rain stinging my face as I walked deeper into the forest, each step heavy with uncertainty. The world around me was a blur of shadows and sound, and yet the only thing that mattered was the need to keep going, to find a way through the storm and back to the people I loved. But the memory of the figure, the fleeting glimpse of her, and the lightning's flash remained, lingering in the darkness as I pressed on, unsure of what lay ahead, unsure of what was real, and unsure of what the storm was trying to show me. The storm was relentless, its fury never wavering. The rain felt like needles against my skin, each drop stinging and cold as it soaked through my clothes, leaving me trembling in its wake. I had been walking for what felt like hours, each step heavier than the last, the world around me a blur of shadows and constant motion. The wind howled through the trees, louder than before, as if it were trying to drown out the pounding of my heart. I had thought, at one point, that I might have been getting closer to my family. The thought of them had kept me moving, step by step, as I ventured deeper into the forest. But now, something was wrong. The feeling in my chest had shifted, no longer a sense of purpose, but a growing unease that wrapped itself around my heart like a vice. I stopped for a moment, my breath ragged in the cold air, trying to steady myself. My eyes darted around the trees, but the thick fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. There were no signs, no clues to where I was or where I was going. The landscape was a blur, nothing but dark shadows and an endless stretch of wet earth beneath my feet. But then, something caught my eye. A faint, shallow impression in the mud, a footprint. I knelt down, heart hammering in my chest, hoping for something, anything that would confirm that I was still on the right path. I traced my finger around the edges of the footprint, trying to make sense of it. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, and I stood quickly, wiping the wet dirt from my hands. But as I looked closer, something in my gut twisted. There was no mistaking it. The print wasn't just similar to the ones I had seen before, it was exactly the same. It was mine. My heart froze in my chest. No, that couldn't be right. I had been following these footprints for hours, hadn't I? The thought had never crossed my mind that they could be my own. But there it was, undeniable, staring me in the face. I had been running in circles. The trail I thought was leading me toward my family had been nothing more than my own steps, winding back on themselves, leading me deeper into the storm. I staggered back, my head spinning. My feet felt like lead, and for a moment I couldn't even tell if I was still standing. It was as though the ground beneath me had slipped away, and the world around me had become nothing but a nightmare. I was lost, utterly, hopelessly lost, and the storm had drawn me deeper into its grasp. The wind howled louder as if mocking me, and the rain became more intense, hammering down like the weight of my own realization. I had been deceived. The trail had been a lie, and every step I had taken had only led me further into the forest, further away from my family. I fell to my knees in the mud, my hands clutching at the soaked earth, as if the ground itself could offer me some comfort. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The fear had consumed me. taken over every ounce of my strength. How had I not seen it? How had I been so blinded by desperation that I had followed my own footprints, thinking they belonged to someone else? The realization sank in, sharp and painful. The storm wasn't the only thing that was chasing me now. I had become my own enemy, caught in a cycle of hopelessness, each turn taking me further into the heart of the woods. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, but the cold was relentless, biting at my skin, numbing me to everything except the fear that gnawed at my insides. I had to keep moving, had to find a way out. But where was the way out? How could I escape this trap when I had no idea where I had even started? The rain pelted my face as I stood shakily, wiping the wetness from my eyes. The sound of the storm seemed to have faded slightly, replaced by the heavy pounding of my heart in my ears. I forced my legs to move, step after heavy step, though every part of me screamed to stop, to give in to the overwhelming sense of despair that was closing in. I turned in a circle, trying to get my bearings, but all I could see was the same dark blur of trees, the same muddy path beneath my feet. But as I looked closer, something in my gut twisted. There was no mistaking it. The print wasn't just similar to the ones I had seen before. It was exactly the same. It was mine. My heart froze in my chest. No, that couldn't be right. I had been following these footprints for hours, hadn't I? The thought had never crossed my mind that they could be my own. But there it was, undeniable, staring me in the face. I had been running in circles. The voice was distant, fading in and out with the wind, but it was there, unmistakable. Sarah, it was my mother's voice. A chill ran down my spine, a mixture of hope and fear flooding me. Had I heard it? Was it real? Or was the storm playing more tricks on me? The world had become a blur, and every sound, every whisper, felt like it was part of the storm's twisted game. I took a step, then another, following the voice, even as doubt crept in. Was it my mother? Or was it just the storm, the wind, the endless rain distorting my senses? The footsteps that I had thought were someone else's had led me back to myself. The storm had drawn me into its web, making me believe that I was still on the right path when all along I had been running in circles. My only hope now was to keep moving, to keep fighting through the fear and the confusion, and pray that somehow the storm would reveal its truth. The rain had not let up since the storm began. It felt like hours, maybe longer, since I first stepped into the forest, desperately searching for my family. I had been walking blindly, my feet squelching in the mud with each step, the rain pelting my face and soaking through my clothes. The weight of my fear seemed to grow with every moment, and it felt as though the storm was closing in on me, a suffocating presence in the dark woods. I needed something to hold onto, some kind of hope. My mind was racing, and the fatigue from walking aimlessly was starting to take its toll. Each step felt heavier than the last. My body ached, my legs trembled, and my head swam with dizziness. I paused for a moment, leaning against a large tree to catch my breath, trying to make sense of it all. Where was I? What had happened to my family? I reached into my pocket, my fingers trembling as I searched for something, anything that could help me. My hand brushed against something hard, and I pulled it out, a small, crumpled piece of paper. At first, I didn't recognize it, but as I unfolded it, I realized it was a map that had been with me for years, a map that had once been so clear and full of life. Now it was nothing more than a tattered, waterlogged mess, the ink smudged and barely legible from the storm's fury. I squinted at the map, the faint outline of a trail still visible despite the water damage. I could just make out a few landmarks, though they appeared distorted, as though the map had been altered by time and exposure. My heart raced, hoping for some sign, something that would tell me where I was, or where I needed to go. I traced the edges of the map with my finger, feeling the rip of the paper as I touched it. The world had become a blur, and every sound, every whisper, felt like it was part of the storm's twisted game. I took a step, then another, following the voice, even as doubt crept in. Was it my mother? Or was it just the storm, the wind, the endless rain distorting my senses? The footsteps that I had thought were someone else's had led me back to myself. The storm had drawn me into its web, making me believe that I was still on the right path when all along I had been running in circles. Could I actually be on the right path after all? Was this map, this torn relic of the past, finally going to guide me back to them? But doubt crept in as quickly as the hope had risen. The map was so damaged, how could I trust it? How could I know if the mark was truly the right one? The rain continued to fall, and the world around me felt so unfamiliar, so distorted by the storm that I couldn't even be sure where I was anymore. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, my breath shallow as I stared at the map. I shook my head, trying to clear the panic that threatened to rise up again. I couldn't let fear control me. This was my chance. I had to follow it. But where was the path? Was this the right direction? My mind was spinning, and all I could do was stare at the map, hoping for some kind of clarity. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The storm had drowned out everything, the sound of my footsteps, the wind in the trees, even the faint echo of my own thoughts. The only thing I could hear now was the steady pounding of my heart and the cold, clammy feeling of uncertainty that had settled deep inside me. With trembling hands, I folded the map carefully and tucked it back into my pocket. There was no time to waste. The storm wasn't going to wait for me. If there was a chance, even the smallest chance, that this mark could lead me to my family, I had to follow it. I could just make out a few landmarks, though they appeared distorted, as though the map had been altered by time and exposure. My heart raced, hoping for some sign, something that would tell me where I was or where I needed to go. I traced the edges of the map with my finger, feeling the rip of the paper as I touched it. The thought of my family, of my mother's face, kept me going. I could almost hear her voice calling me, urging me to find my way home. But the more I thought about it, the more the voice seemed to fade, lost in the howling wind. I was alone in this, and every step felt like a step further away from everything I had ever known. But then I stopped. The air shifted. The wind died down, and for a moment, the forest seemed too quiet. The howling storm became nothing but a distant hum, and the pounding of the rain on the leaves above me softened. I stood in the silence, my heart racing, listening for any sound, any sign that I was not alone. And then there it was. A whisper, faint and almost drowned by the storm's fury, but it was unmistakable. Sarah. My breath caught in my throat. The voice so familiar, so comforting was my mother's. I knew it instantly. But it wasn't the voice I had been hoping for. It wasn't a voice of reassurance, a voice of warmth. It was cold, distant, as if it were being carried by the storm itself. I froze, a cold chill running down my spine. Was this real, or was it just another trick of the storm? My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands trembled at my sides. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The forest around me felt alive with something I couldn't understand, something ancient and unforgiving. I clutched the map tightly in my hand, my mind racing as I tried to decide what to do. The path ahead was unclear, but something deep within me told me that the answer was out there. Somewhere in this storm, somewhere in this forest, was the truth. But as I took a step forward, the wind picked up again, and the voice faded into the distance, lost in the storm's fury. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to believe, but one thing was certain. The storm was far from over. The storm had grown fiercer with each passing moment, the rain lashing against the ground like needles, the wind howling through the trees, bending them as if they were fragile reeds. I was soaked through, my clothes clinging to my body, my legs heavy with exhaustion. I stumbled along the muddy trail, or what I thought was a trail, my heart pounding in my chest, each step feeling like it might be my last. The map had given me a sliver of hope, but now that hope was fading, slipping through my fingers like water. The cold was unbearable. I couldn't remember how long I had been lost. The only thing that kept me going was the thought of finding my family. My mind was consumed with their faces, my mother's smile, my father's reassuring voice. I clung to these memories like a lifeline, even though the storm had stolen everything else from me. But just as the weight of despair began to settle in, something happened. A whisper, a voice, so soft, so soothing, that for a moment, I wasn't sure I had even heard it at all. I'm here. It came from behind me, familiar, warm, like a memory I had longed for. My mother. My heart skipped a beat. My body froze. Could it be? I turned quickly, my eyes frantically scanning the dark woods, the rain-slicked trees, the shadowy figures that seemed to sway in the wind. But there was no one, nothing. I stood there, breathless, my pulse racing, straining to hear the voice again. Had it really been her? Or was it just the storm playing tricks on my mind? My hands trembled as I reached up, wiping the wet strands of hair from my face, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe the storm had finally broken me. But no, I couldn't deny what I had heard. The voice, so clear, so real, despite the chaos of the storm, was my mother's. I could feel it deep in my bones. I'm here. The words echoed in my mind, but as I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized something even more terrifying. The voice was close, so close, as if it were just behind me. The very air around me seemed to vibrate with the sound, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a chill crawling down my spine. I could almost feel her presence, her warmth, her love, as though she were standing right there, just beyond the reach of my eyes. I spun around again, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mom," I whispered into the storm, my voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. "Mom," but there was nothing, just the swirling darkness, the endless trees, and the torrential downpour. The storm had swallowed everything, every sound, every trace of hope. For a moment, I stood frozen, my heart a heavy weight in my chest, the absence of my mother's voice ringing louder than any storm ever could. The silence stretched on, unbearable. Had I imagined it? Was I truly alone, lost in the forest with nothing but the storm to keep me company? The question lingered in my mind, but it was drowned by a new wave of fear. What if I was hearing things? What if the storm had taken hold of my mind, twisting reality until I couldn't even trust my own senses? I wanted to believe. I wanted to believe that my mother was out there, somewhere, calling to me, waiting for me to find her. But doubt crept in, and the harsh truth weighed heavily on my shoulders. The world was so vast, and I was so small. The storm was so relentless, and I was powerless against it. But then, just as despair began to sink its teeth into my soul, the voice came again. "I'm here." This time, it was even softer than before. Barely a whisper, but still unmistakably her voice. My heart jolted in my chest, and I spun around once more, my eyes wide with fear and longing. I called out to her again, my voice breaking as I cried, "Mom." This time I didn't wait. I didn't hesitate. My legs moved on their own, carrying me through the rain-soaked woods, past trees that loomed like giants in the dark. My mind was clouded with confusion, my thoughts fragmented. But one thing was clear, there was no turning back now. I had to find her. The storm, the fear, the uncertainty, they didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the voice, the promise of safety, the hope that maybe, just maybe, my mother was out there, calling for me. The wind howled in my ears, and the rain slapped against my face, blurring my vision, but I pushed forward. Each step felt like an eternity. but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. Her voice was still there, guiding me, urging me on. I stumbled and fell once, the mud pulling at my boots, but I pushed myself up and kept moving. The trees seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching like hands reaching for me, but I didn't care. I didn't have time to be afraid. The voice was real. It had to be. I'm here. I heard it again, clearer now, and it came from somewhere up ahead. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my heart hammering in my chest. The storm raged on, but the voice, it was my mother, just ahead, waiting for me. I took one final step into the clearing, my eyes straining in the darkness. But when I looked up, there was nothing, no one, just the relentless rain and the silence of the storm. My legs gave way beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, my hands clutching the muddy earth. I sobbed, the tears mixing with the rain, my body trembling with exhaustion and disbelief. Was I losing my mind? Had the storm taken everything from me, including my grip on reality? But then, from behind me, I heard it again. I'm here. This time, it was so close, I could feel the breath on my neck. I turned slowly, my body frozen in terror, and found nothing but darkness. And in that darkness, the storm raged on, swallowing the voice whole. The rain was relentless, drumming against the earth like an angry symphony, each drop a harsh reminder of how lost I truly was. The wind howled, tearing through the trees, as if the very forest was alive with fury. My clothes were soaked through, clinging to my skin, but I didn't care anymore. I was beyond the point of cold, beyond the point of fear. The only thing left was the aching, desperate need to find them. My family, my mother, my father. I had no idea how much time had passed since I first found myself lost in the storm. The hours bled together, each moment dragging me deeper into confusion. The forest seemed endless, the trees a dark maze that I couldn't escape. My steps were slow, my body heavy with exhaustion. I was beginning to feel as though I would never find my way out, never find the familiar faces I had been searching for. And then, through the blur of rain, I saw something. A small structure stood ahead, barely visible through the downpour. At first, I thought it was just another tree or rock, but as I got closer, I realized it was a shelter, old and worn, but unmistakable. The kind of place someone might seek refuge in when the world outside was too dangerous. Relief washed over me, though I knew better than to get my hopes up too high. It could be empty. It could be another false hope, another dead end in the storm. But I couldn't stand out in the rain anymore. I needed to find shelter, even if it was just for a moment. So I stumbled toward the shelter, my legs weak, my breath shallow, each step a battle against the growing panic inside me. The shelter was made of rough wood, its roof sagging under the weight of the rain. I pushed open the door, feeling the coolness of the air inside brush against my skin. It was dark, but not completely so. There was enough light from the occasional flash of lightning to make out the shapes within. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, the sound of the storm muffled by the walls around me. The storm raged on, but the voice, it was my mother, just ahead, waiting for me. I took one final step into the clearing, my eyes straining in the darkness. But when I looked up, there was nothing, no one, just the relentless rain and the silence of the storm. My legs gave way beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, my hands clutching the muddy earth. It was faint, almost fading, but it was unmistakable. The last time I had smelled it was when he had hugged me goodbye, the last time I had seen him before everything had changed. The realization hit me like a wave. My heart leaped in my chest, and I stepped further into the shelter, my hands shaking. I scanned the room quickly, desperate for any sign of him or my mother, but there was nothing, no one. Just the empty, damp room that echoed with memories. I could feel my hope slipping away again, the walls of the shelter closing in on me. I wanted to believe they had been here, that they were waiting for me just outside. But the silence was deafening, and the scent of my father's cologne was only a cruel reminder of what I had lost. I gasped, the air rushing out of my lungs as I staggered to my feet. "Mom," my voice trembled, as though I were testing whether this moment was real or just another cruel illusion. But she was there, standing before me, her hand still resting on my shoulder. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. My heart pounded in my chest, disbelief and joy swirling together in a confusing mix of emotions. I closed my eyes, hoping for a moment of peace, for a fleeting sense of safety. But even the shelter couldn't offer that. The more I tried to calm myself, the more I realized the storm was no longer just outside. It had settled within me. It had been hours, days, maybe how long had I been lost? The exhaustion had dulled my senses, and the scent of my father's cologne, once a comfort, now felt like a cruel mockery of everything I had lost. The ache in my chest deepened. I sat there, in that abandoned shelter, with only the rain and my memories to keep me company. The storm raged on, and I couldn't help but wonder if it would ever stop. Would I ever see them again? The thought lingered in my mind, dark and suffocating. Every sound outside the shelter felt like a warning. Every crack of lightning felt like a judgment. The world was so vast, so wild, and I was just a tiny speck in it, drifting in the storm alone. And yet, I clung to the hope that somehow my family was still out there, just beyond the reach of the storm, just beyond the darkness. But as the rain began to flood the shelter, soaking the wooden floors, I realized that hope was all I had left. And even that, I feared, was slipping away with every passing moment. The storm continued its relentless assault on the world outside, each drop of rain striking the shelter like a warning, a reminder that I was still trapped in the vast, dark expanse of the forest. The smell of wet earth and pine mingled with the scent of my father's cologne that had lingered in the small, abandoned shelter. The faint traces of him felt like an anchor, holding me in place, even as the panic threatened to rise again in my chest. I could barely see anything now, the rain falling so heavily that even the dim flashes of lightning seemed to struggle to break through. It felt as if the whole world had drowned in the storm, as if there was nothing left but the unyielding noise of wind and water. I was still kneeling in the corner of the shelter, my head buried in my hands, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that I hadn't lost them forever. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that I might never see them again. I had been wandering for so long, lost in the storm, following paths that seemed to lead nowhere, all the while chasing after a hope that was fading with every step. My clothes were drenched, my body aching with exhaustion, but the worst of it was the emptiness I felt inside, a hollow space that nothing could fill. I was just about to close my eyes and surrender to the darkness, hoping that sleep would offer some escape from the storm, when I felt it, a warmth, a hand on my shoulder. I froze, my breath hitched, and for a moment I thought I had imagined it. The storm outside was deafening, yet in that moment, everything else seemed to stop. The wind, the rain, the ache in my chest, it all faded as I turned, slowly, instinctively, to see who had touched me. I couldn't believe my eyes. There, standing in the entrance of the shelter, was my mother. She was drenched, her clothes clinging to her body, her face pale but alive. Her wet hair clung to her face, her eyes wide with concern. But there was no mistaking it was her. I gasped, the air rushing out of my lungs as I staggered to my feet. "Mom," my voice trembled, as though I were testing whether this moment was real or just another cruel illusion. But she was there, standing before me, her hand still resting on my shoulder. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. My heart pounded in my chest, disbelief and joy swirling together in a confusing mix of emotions. It felt as though time itself had stopped, as if the storm, the forest, the entire world had paused to let us catch up. Where, where have you been? I stammered, my voice cracking with the weight of my fear, my confusion. I've been looking for you, looking for all of you. I thought I was lost forever. But she held up a hand, silencing me. Her expression was calm, though I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the same exhaustion I felt. I'm here now, she whispered, her voice soft and soothing, like a balm to my frayed nerves. I'm here. I stepped toward her, as if drawn by an invisible force, my hands trembling as I reached out. She took them in hers, her grip warm and steady, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to relax. Her touch was the only thing that felt real in this storm, the only thing that made sense in the chaos. But as I looked at her, something tugged at the back of my mind. There was something about her eyes that seemed different, something about the way she stood so still, so composed. For a fleeting second, I wondered if this was really my mother, or if my mind was playing tricks on me, pulling her out of the darkness as a figment of my desperate need for comfort. Are you okay? I whispered, my voice trembling once more as I searched her face, my eyes desperately trying to find the mother I had known all my life. The woman who had always been there, who had never left me. She smiled that same gentle, reassuring smile that I had always remembered. I'm fine. We'll be all right now. Let's just wait for the storm to pass, and we'll figure it out. Everything will be okay. I nodded, though a small part of me remained on edge, questioning everything. The storm outside, the eerie calm inside, the warmth of her touch, it all felt too perfect, too easy. But I didn't care. I wanted to believe. I needed to believe. We sat there, in the shelter, huddled together as the storm raged on outside. I couldn't remember how much time passed. Minutes, hours. The world outside felt like a distant memory as I clung to the woman I had always loved. But deep down, I could still hear the howling wind, still feel the weight of the storm pressing in on me. And as I sat there, my head resting against my mother's shoulder, I realized something. The storm outside wasn't the only thing I needed to be afraid of. There was something else, something in the silence, in the way my mother spoke, in the way she held me close. But for now, I couldn't bring myself to ask. I didn't want to know. All I wanted was to believe that this moment, this warmth, was real. Even if it wasn't, the storm outside howled like a beast, its voice crashing against the shelter, as if it wanted to tear everything apart. The wind whipped through the trees, bending them low, and the rain fell in sheets that seemed endless. The storm outside, the eerie calm inside, the warmth of her touch, it all felt too perfect, too easy. But I didn't care. I wanted to believe. I needed to believe. We sat there, in the shelter, huddled together as the storm raged on outside. I couldn't remember how much time passed, minutes, hours. As I pulled away from her slightly, just enough to see her face, I felt tears welling up in my eyes, hot and thick, spilling over. I couldn't stop them. The relief, the fear, the overwhelming emotions, I had no way to contain it. I reached out for her again, and she held me tightly, her arms wrapping around me as if she, too, had been waiting for this moment. I knew I'd find you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I couldn't help but nod, even though doubt had gnawed at me, even though I hadn't been sure if I was chasing shadows. But here we were, together, like I had always imagined. I thought I was lost, I whispered, my voice trembling. I thought I'd never see you again. We're here now, she said, her words soft, reassuring. Her hand gently stroked my hair, the motion so familiar, so comforting, I almost couldn't bear it. We're together, you're safe. Safe. The word hung in the air, and for a brief moment I let myself believe it. But something in the distance, something in the wind, kept me on edge. The storm outside was fierce, but it wasn't just the weather that unsettled me. It was the feeling that the forest, the world around us, hadn't yet decided to let us go. The shelter felt like a fragile bubble in the midst of a raging tempest. I glanced toward the door, watching the flickering shadows cast by the lightning. The trees outside bent and swayed like giants in pain, and the air smelled heavy, damp, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. I wanted to ask her if she felt it too, the weight of the storm, the pressing sense of danger that still lingered, even with her here. We stumbled toward the nearest house, our shoes squelching through the mud. And as we reached the door, a kind-faced older woman opened it, her eyes wide with concern. She must have heard the storm, or perhaps just seen the three of us emerge from the woods, soaked to the bone. Without a word, she ushered us inside, her hands shaking slightly as she helped us out of our drenched coats. "You're here now," she said softly, her voice a balm to my shattered nerves. "I'm here. You're not alone." Her words wrapped around me like a blanket, warm and soothing, and for a while, I allowed myself to close my eyes and imagine that we were somewhere safe, somewhere far away from the storm, from the darkness, from the fear. But even in that fleeting moment of peace, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air outside was too still, too thick with tension. The storm seemed to grow angrier by the second, as though it was refusing to let us go. And in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder, how long would this fragile peace last? But for now, in this moment, I let myself believe it would last forever. I pulled back, just slightly, enough to meet her eyes. My mother's face, tired but alive, held a soft, knowing smile. "Where's Dad?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. For a moment, she just looked at me, her expression shifting from calm to something else, something that flickered in her eyes before disappearing. "He'll be here soon," she said, but the way she said it, with the slightest tremor in her voice, made my stomach tighten. I wanted to press her for more, to demand answers, but something in her gaze stopped me. It was as if she were holding something back, something she wasn't ready to share. The wind outside howled again, louder this time, and a branch scraped against the roof of the shelter, with a sound that sent a chill down my spine. The storm was still here. It was still there, swirling in the quiet corners of my mind. My mother sat next to me, her arms around me as she had done so many times before, but there was a distance in her eyes. I couldn't quite understand it, but I felt it. She held me as if to reassure herself, as if trying to convince herself that we had truly survived, that we were really here, in this warm house, away from the danger. For the first time in days, I felt as if I could finally breathe. But even as I closed my eyes, the storm raged on, the forest around us still angry, still waiting. The storm had finally relented. The wind that had torn through the forest for so many hours now whispered softly through the trees, and the heavy rain, though still present in distant drips, seemed to lessen as if it had given up its pursuit. As we stumbled through the final stretch of the forest, the world around us seemed to sigh in relief. The oppressive tension that had clung to the air for what felt like forever began to lift, and for the first time since the storm had started, I felt as if we had made it. But as we emerged from the woods, my legs trembling with exhaustion, something inside me didn't feel the same. The rain was softer, and the sky, though still heavy, looked a little less menacing. The world around us was quieter, calmer, yet, within me, the storm still raged. It was like the chaos outside had mirrored the chaos inside me, and even as the world calmed, the turmoil I felt remained. We didn't speak much in those first few steps into the village. My mother, her face drawn with fatigue but relieved to be out of the storm, walked beside me. We were moving forward, yes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different now. Something had changed. The village was quiet as we approached, the houses small and nestled together on a hillside. It was an unfamiliar place, one I had never seen before, But its simplicity, its stillness, was a comfort in that moment. We stumbled toward the nearest house, our shoes squelching through the mud. And as we reached the door, a kind-faced older woman opened it, her eyes wide with concern. She must have heard the storm, or perhaps just seen the three of us emerge from the woods. Soaked to the bone, without a word, she ushered us inside, her hands shaking slightly as she helped us out of our drenched coats. The oppressive tension that had clung to the air for what felt like forever began to lift, and for the first time since the storm had started, I felt as if we had made it. But as we emerged from the woods, my legs trembling with exhaustion, something inside me didn't feel the same. It was still there, swirling in the quiet corners of my mind. My mother sat next to me, her arms around me as she had done so many times before, but there was a distance in her eyes. I couldn't quite understand it, but I felt it. She held me as if to reassure herself, as if trying to convince herself that we had truly survived, that we were really here in this warm house, away from the danger. I looked around the room, and for the first time, I truly saw it. The deep, silent toll the storm had taken on us all. We were together, yes, but the storm had left its mark. The fear, the panic, the uncertainty had changed something in all of us. I turned to my mother, my voice soft but filled with the same raw emotion I'd felt since the night had begun. "Are we really safe now?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I mean, ... are we really okay? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at me, her brow furrowed, her gaze distant for just a moment before it softened. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as though unsure of the right words. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. "We're together," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We made it out. We're okay." But even as she said the words, I could feel the uncertainty in them. It wasn't just the storm that had changed things. It was something deeper. The storm hadn't just raged outside it, had raged within us too, leaving scars that would never fade. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling the weight of it. The storm inside me wasn't going to disappear just because the wind had stopped. I had survived, yes, but I didn't feel whole. My body was here, but my mind still felt lost, like a part of me had been left behind in the woods. "We're okay," my mother repeated, as if trying to convince herself more than me. I wanted to believe her, I really did, but as the wind whistled faintly through the cracks in the walls of the house, I couldn't help but feel that the storm was still out there waiting. We stayed in the village for the night, tucked away in that small house, where the fire in the hearth flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the walls. The woman who had let us in offered us food, but my appetite was non-existent. I couldn't taste anything. The only thing I could feel was the weight of the silence, the pressure in the air, the knowing that the world around me had changed, had become something new, something we hadn't fully prepared for. I lay in bed that night, staring out the window at the starless sky, and though the storm had stopped, I couldn't find peace. The wind had died, but the storm inside me had only just begun to show its true face. As I closed my eyes, I thought of my father, wondering where he was, whether he had made it through the storm too. The fear, the uncertainty, the longing, it all mixed together in my mind, swirling like the storm we had just survived. But we were together, at least for now. That was something. I held on to that, even as the world outside became still. The promise of home was there, just out of reach. But I knew, deep inside, that no matter how far we went, no matter where we tried to hide, the storm, the one inside us, would follow. And that was something we would have to learn to live with.